Sound check one. Good morning. Welcome to the Audit, Finance, and Administration Committee meeting. Today is Thursday, November 21st, 2024. I see Councillor Clark and Councillor Beattie online, Councillor Maureen Wilson, Councillor Tattison, and Councillor Crutcher in chambers with me. And I believe we have quorum present, so I'd like to call this meeting of the Audit, Finance, and Administration Committee meeting to order. All electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. But before we actually get started, we have some fun news. So I'm going to ask GM Zagaric to start us off.
Good morning. Through you, Madam Chair. Mike Zagaric, General Manager, Finance Corporate Services. I just don't want people to be confused that Clayton is Martin. So my pleasure to introduce the most recent addition to our Corporate Services Departmental Leadership Team. Clayton Pereira joins the City of Hamilton and is our leader for our Revenue Services Division. And this includes property taxation, vacant unit tax, and utility billing. Clayton brings over 20 years of municipal leadership experience in municipal financial planning, taxation, assessment, and collection services. Most recently, Clayton has held the position of Deputy Treasurer Manager of Budgets and Financial Planning at the town of Whitchurch, Stouffville, and was successful in implementing multi-year budgeting and new service-based budget format. Clayton is described as unselfish, motivated by a strong sense of duty, and derives satisfaction from doing good work for the team. So please join me in welcoming Clayton to the City of Hamilton.
Director, we are very excited to have you here. Is there did you want to just introduce yourself at all, or did you want to speak at all? Put you on the spot, you know?
Thank you very much. I know I don't really have much to say other than I'm looking forward to the Revenue Services portfolio. Very excited on some of the challenges and looking forward to working with everybody.
Words to be memorialized, because we're definitely we're all going to have a lot of fun with you. So thank you so much for joining Team Hamilton, and we're very excited to have you.
Thanks
welcome.
Again.
Also welcome as an observer and as a cheerleader, I think, is Councillor Carcassar is also online, and just joining us in Council Chambers is Councillor Mike Spadafora. So let's get into the meat and potatoes now. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to this agenda?
Yes, Madam Chair, we have a number of changes to the agenda. Under item 6, delegation requests, we have item 6.1, Ian Borsick, Environment Hamilton, respecting item 8.1, Voluntary Advisory Committee Review. That's for today's meeting. Under item 10, discussion items, we have 10.6A, inclusion of studies in the 2024 Development Charges Bylaw, FCS 24051 citywide. I will note that this was originally placed on the agenda with the as to be circulated, and it had the wrong title, so I put it as 10.6A to avoid confusion. Then we have item 13, general information and other item 10.7, review of the council codes of conduct at other municipalities respecting limiting or prohibiting the accepting of gifts of elected officials, FCS 24057 citywide. That's an outstanding business list item. And following that, we also have the addition of 10.3 under general information and other business, 13.1 AD, amendment to the Code of Conduct Policy, added June 1st, 2023. Subsection B, addressed as item 10.7 on today's agenda, has been added so that will come off today as well. And then we have changes to the order of the agenda. 10.7, I'm not going to read that title again, but the review of the council codes of conduct at other municipalities will be moved up on the agenda to be considered immediately following item 10.5, as the two reports are related.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Clerk, may I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda as amended? Councillor Spadafora, Councillor Tattison. Any discussion on this agenda as presented? Seeing none, may I have the vote, please? Councillor M. Wilson is a yes. It's not coming up yet. I will try to announce it. We'll just let LC Bates get through. Just waiting for the vote to come up, just so that people online and on YouTube know why the pause. No, we haven't seen it yet, so. The robots are moving a little slow today.
I'm sorry, I think we're going to have to take a manual vote on that by show of hands.
All right, manual vote, please. Both Counselor Clark and Counselor Beatty are yes, and everyone else, it's unanimous.
Thank you. And it was Councillor Spatafor and Tattison?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, and based on the show of hands, that carries. Moving on to declaration of interest, are there any declarations of interest? Okay, seeing none, let's move on to the approval of minutes. May I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the minutes of the meeting happening on November 7th, 2024 as presented? Councillor Spatafora and Councillor Maureen Wilson. All right, any discussion on the approval of the minutes, please? Seeing none? Shh. Okay. All right, and the vote is up, please. And that vote carries 7-0. Thank you. Now we are moving on to delegation requests. 6.1 is Ian Borsick from Environment Hamilton respecting item 8.1 for the Volunteer Advisory Committee review, and that's for today's meeting. May I please have a mover and a seconder to approve this delegation request as presented, please? Councillor Tattison and Councillor Crutch? Yes. Any discussion on this delegation request? Okay, seeing none, may I have the vote, please? Vote is up. Okay, and Councillor M. Wilson is a yes. And that vote carries 7-0. We are now moving on to delegations. Members are reminded that questions of the delegations are for clarification purposes only and not for debate. Up now is Ian Borsick, Environment Hamilton, respecting item 8.1 Volunteer Advisory Committee review, and this is a virtual delegation. Ian, you know the drill, so if there's anything that you need, and you're welcome to start at any time.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Wang, or Chair Wang. Hello, Audit, Finance and Administration Committee. My name is Ian Borsick. I'm the Executive Director of Environment Hamilton. And I'm providing some comment and reaction to the report that's before you, the Volunteer Advisory Committee review. I'm speaking primarily from my own personal experience here. I have spoken over the last week with a number of previous and current committee members, including people who went through the consultation process for this review. I just want to be very clear. I'm just sharing anecdotal information beyond my own personal experience. But speaking with other members of the Climate Change Advisory Committee, which I co-chair, speaking with other people involved in the local community, I think that there needs to be a serious pause given to this review. Yes, I absolutely understand the intentions that were behind this initial review. As I'm sure you're all aware, and people in the community have heard this for years, as far back as long as I've lived in Hamilton, there have been problems with these citizen committees. There's instances where, committee members don't necessarily understand how procedural bylaw works, and staff struggle to work with them through that. There's committees where it's been reported by members that the councillors that were assigned to liaise with those committees never attended. And so there's a lot of issues with these committees that I think could be improved upon. However, sitting on my very first advisory committee, sitting as a co-chair at the Climate Change Advisory Committee, I've seen how it can work. We have 3 councillor liaison members who have really taken a proactive approach to helping people clarify and understand how processes work. The OCCI staff have really taken a proactive effort to engage with the members and ensure that the processes work and that we understand why the processes were laid out. And importantly, it's important to really stress that what I think a lot of us on the committee appreciate and what a lot of other committee members appreciate is that they are formal, on the record, transparent committees that have accountability mechanisms within them. Yes, they could be improved, but the matter of it is I've sat on working groups that the city has convened by staff, and what I have to say in those working groups don't always end up in a report. For example, I was sitting on the extreme heat working group with a number of other community members, and there were elements of the extreme heat response plan that were not discussed at those working group meetings. And when we brought forward delegations asking for additions to be put into that plan because it wasn't discussed at the working group or it wasn't part of the scope of the working group, we were then told that we were undermining the work of that working group. And because there wasn't any minutes, that there wasn't any recording of what was happening or anything like that, it wasn't entirely clear for us as members of this staff-led group what the recourse was when we had an issue with what was coming about. From the review on page 8, for our purposes in Hamilton, the model we are recommending is the community liaison group. A community liaison group reports directly to staff to advise on the community perspective, which staff includes in the process of making recommendations to council. This is not a transparent process that's being described that has accountability built in. Such groups can meet in person, regularly, or even virtually, corresponding over email to share recommendations, like a public information session. Again, not a formal advisory committee, not something where people can be held accountable to. It's like a public information session. And I'm sorry, I've attended a lot of public information sessions. They are not the same level of intensity and in-depth knowledge sharing that community advisory committees are. These groups are chaired and called to order by departmental staff and do not follow procedural bylaw. We are removing the citizens component of this and the citizen leadership as part of what's happening on these committees with this. And this is an intentional change that's going to be happening if this review is approved. Additionally, on page 9, it is said explicitly, it is towards a staff-directed community liaison working group. The staff will report back on an annual basis to the relevant committee on any feedback that happens in those groups. This means that there is no minutes, there is no policies that the members have to abide by. That fundamentally the power that we have as citizen members of these committees is being stripped away, and now we're just advising staff, and maybe staff will use it, take it or leave it. Now, that exact criticism has been lobbied at these current committees. Members have told me that they were entirely unsure what was happening with the feedback that was being given. What was the actual follow through? What was the accountability process? And that's made even more difficult if you don't have a counselor actually attending those committee meetings, working with staff and committee members. I absolutely recognize that there are problems with this system, but the Climate Change Advisory Committee has absolutely bucked this trend, if it is in fact a trend. So at the very least, if you do not refer this to further consultation and actually engage with the community on how we're going to formally engage and empower citizens to engage with decisions being made by this council between elections, please, at the very least, recognize what's working, where it is working, and exclude the Climate Change Advisory Committee from this effort, at least until the end of this term. But ultimately, what is being presented right now is a fundamental stripping away of democratic participation by citizens in City Hall. I, again, absolutely recognize that there are problems with this system, but it needs council and staff to put in more effort to ensure that citizens are engaged with, that citizens understand the procedural bylaws that are being presented to them, and understand that by having a transparent and accountable process, when there is dissent, when there is disagreement, it's on the record. Right now, if I'm in a staff working group and I dissent or I have a disagreement, it isn't recorded. And then I have to delegate and I have to come to council to express that. And that isn't being afforded to committee members if these changes go through. This needs more consultation and more work on it.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you for letting me go over. I apologize.
Okay. All right. And we have a speakers list open. Currently on the list is Councillor Clark, followed by Councillor Cretch. Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, and good morning to Ian. I don't know where to begin with some of my questions because you were pretty comprehensive in your commentary. When I looked at the report, I consider what is a liaison committee and what is an advisory committee. Can you perhaps in your own words explain the difference between the advisory committee and the liaison committee?
Yeah, I think a really good example is what we've recently been going through with the Climate Change Advisory Committee, where staff brought forward most recently, the recommendations for how to spend the climate reserve funds for this year. And there was a robust discussion that was had by the committee. And I think what committee members really appreciate about that is, yes, it was a robust discussion. And yes, the committee understood that not necessarily everything we were saying was going to be acted upon or taken by staff or taken by council. But at the same time, it was a live streamed meeting. There's minutes being taken. The points that are being made by each individual member are on the record. So even if, even if you don't win, the argument, it's at least on the record that this happened. With a liaison group, you can have a terms of reference and there can be taken minutes, but those minutes aren't publicly shared. The membership isn't publicly shared. The members that are invited to these liaison groups are there at the whim of staff and aren't being appointed by council to fulfill a service on behalf of the community. And I think furthermore, we have a real risk of going down this route of, there was discussions when the Climate Change Advisory Committee was being struck about, well, how do we ensure, regular people sit on the committee? And by regular people, we mean people who aren't me, right? A full-time environmentalist who actively does advocacy within the city. If we're moving in the direction of these liaison groups, how will staff know who these regular people are who maybe have really good expertise but just aren't engaged unless there's a public call out and a reaffirmation to that person that by dedicating your time to this committee, that you're in a position that has power, right? And you have responsibility. And when you're just being invited to a liaison group where you're providing some input to staff, that doesn't have the same weight to it that I think is really appealing for some people, but it also doesn't have the same level of accountability and transparency that I personally really value from my experience on my first committee.
Thank you, Ian. And you've had a great deal of experience working with the city of Hamilton over many decades. So I appreciate your comments. I think they're, while comprehensive, they really do get to the point. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cretch, please.
Thanks for your delegation. I can see why perhaps you may look at the report and see some of these outcomes, but a couple questions for you. One, specifically about the procedural bylaw. I think, if you've spoken to former advisory committee members as I have, you would probably have noted that one of the challenges they faced actually was the constraints of the procedural bylaw and some of the rules inherent in this actually limiting their ability and putting barriers in for their participation because they're being held to a certain kind of standard that frankly many volunteers can. What are your comments on that?
I think it's a valid concern. I absolutely recognize that, but I think at the same time, there are benefits that obeying that procedural bylaw and having those rules and constraints enables us to exist as a serious committee of City Hall. And we're not just meeting up with staff and telling them what we think. We have to follow rules. We have to ensure that we're doing things properly because then that way we're providing information in a way that follows the procedures of the city. Do I think that there could be more room for, let's say, informal consultation? Absolutely. Do I think that For example, speaking to my own personal experience in the Climate Change Advisory Committee, we're finding ways of ensuring that we can work within the procedural bylaw in a creative way that doesn't violate the bylaws, but it still ensures that level of accountability and transparency through the establishment of working groups and ensuring that working groups are very clear about what they need to report to the larger committee. I think that's getting to it. But that said, I agree with that concern, but I don't think abolishing advisory committees entirely, aside from, I believe it's like just the one or two that legally have to remain, is the answer to this. Like, it really feels like we have a broken system. I recognize that entirely. And we're just kind of taking a sledgehammer to it and building something new instead of fixing it, where I think there's a lot of positive elements to the system we have now that could be really strengthened and improved upon if we kind of took a different approach to it.
Thanks. I just want to clarify, what you're trying to do here is ensure that this continues to be citizen-led, there continues to be documentation, there continues to be a way for citizens who participate in these advisory committees to get reports and information to council that's on the record, and that seems to be the point you're making. I think there's balance here in what you're saying, if I understand it, which is that, yes, there are some overly prescriptive things here perhaps we don't need to be doing. We want to make sure that we maintain enough official channels and enough ability for citizens to be able to communicate their recommendations clearly to members of council, because that's the point of them giving advice. Do I understand that correctly?
I think you do, Councillor. And just furthermore, I really think, informal discussions with staff, I meet with city staff and provide my, essentially my opinion quite a lot. And for me in my role, I understand what's going on there, right? I have an experience and I'm a professional lobbyist, more or less. Other members of these committees don't have the same role within the city that I do. So having an informal discussion with staff, and it's being staff run, the meeting is convened by staff are laying out the agenda, and then, on an annual basis, staff say what they heard from the community. That doesn't give me, as a community member who maybe doesn't have as much ability and platform as I personally do, the ability to really, maybe make all the suggestions I want to make, or be as engaged as I want to be, because I'll say, well, what's the point in really attending these meetings anymore? Because staff already disagree with me and it's not going to make it into the report. And I don't, I work a 9 to 5, so I can't delegate to the relevant committee. By moving away from that, we've eliminated the ability for that transparency and accountability to really happen, that I really think is important. And losing that could be really detrimental. And then furthermore, it being citizen-led, I think, is really important, because it really shows that these are the concerns and direction that citizens are interested in. And I, again, absolutely appreciate, some of the feedback that is in the report that I'm sure you're all familiar with, where many citizens don't even know about the committees that we have. Many citizens don't know what's actually being discussed at these committees. But I think those problems could be fixed, not through community liaison groups, but through improving the system we have currently, or reforming it in some way that still retains those really core democratic principles.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate your advocacy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there questions or comments questions for this delegation at all? Seeing none, thank you very much, Ian. May I have a mover and a seconder to receive the delegation and refer it for consideration of the Volunteer Advisory Committee Review Item 8.1, please? Councillor Crutch and Councillor Taddison. And I do recognize Councillor Alex Wilson is here. May I have the vote, please? Vote is up. It is.
Just waiting for Councillor Clark.
I think Councillor Clark turned his video off.
Did he? I can't see him.
And that carries 7-0. Thank you. Moving on to staff presentations. 8.1 is the Volunteer Advisory Committee review. I'd like to call upon Rebecca Banky, Project Manager, Community of Inclusion and Equity, and a representative from the Social Policy Research Council is here. Yes? Come on down to begin your presentation. And I'd like to call upon Director Jessica Chase to give us opening remarks, please.
Thank you. Through the chair, just while Rebecca's getting set up, I'll provide some opening remarks. My name is Jessica Chase. I'm the Acting Director of Communications and Engagement. And I'm joined here today by Rebecca Banky, who's the Project Manager of Community Inclusion and Equity, who's going to be leading the presentation, as well as Cindy Munch, who's behind me here to my right, who's the Manager of Community Initiatives, as well as we have Matthew Trenham, the City Clerk, who is joining us virtually today. And I also want to acknowledge that we have the Social Planning and Research Council, who's in the gallery today and did help us with this report, conducting many of the engagement sessions and interviews that have informed the recommendations that are before you today. I just want to say before Rebecca does launch into the presentation that the recommendations that are before you today have been based on significant engagement with internal staff, with councillors, as well as with current and former volunteer advisory members. It's also been based on municipal best practice and research across municipalities, and it is in alignment with the direction that many other municipalities are taking. What they strive to do today with the recommendations that we put before you is to improve in community engagement by developing a more flexible model that is less bound by some of the procedural requirements that we know can create barriers for some in our community to engage with the city. And the intent is for them to be better integrated into departmental work plans. Before turning it over to Rebecca, I would be remiss as well not to acknowledge the contributions of the volunteer advisory staff liaisons, the city councillors that sit and participate on the advisory committees, and of course the dedication of the residents that are part of the volunteer advisory committees within the city. I'm now going to turn it over to Rebecca. Rebecca has led this work in her role as the project manager, and prior to joining the city was a former member and chair of an advisory committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and members of the Audit, Finance and Administration, members of the public, staff. We're talking today about the Voluntary Advisory Committee Review, which has been a project that's been going on for some time now. And I just want to launch into things. First, I want to talk a bit about what civic engagement is. You know, meaningful civic engagement is a partnership in community. It's about co-creating work. It's about informing decision-making. It's inclusive decision-making processes that require a certain amount of active participation from those involved. And it's a dialogue. You know, it's not a conversation that starts, directed from one person and trickles down a chain. It's intended to be a collaboration. We're focused on outcomes, building capacity, and educating the public and people involved in the process on civic engagement processes. So what are voluntary advisory committees? We have 14 of them right now, which is rather a lot by the standards of other cities we've spoken with. They're comprised of very passionate, very civically engaged residents, and they're volunteers who are, in many cases doing this work for sandwiches, They provide advice and recommendations on issues of policy. They're diverse in their expertise. They have a range of priorities. Some come from an advocacy background, as you've seen. Some are residents who don't have that kind of expertise, but are passionate about the topics that they're talking about. They're council directed at the moment. They're supported by clerks and departmental staff liaisons, and they're considered local boards, which makes them subject to some unique liabilities and expectations. This is a little bit of an overview of the current organization of where our voluntary advisory committees sit, which ones we have, what their reporting relationships look like. And what was the purpose of the Voluntary Advisory Committee review? Well, the last review was conducted in 2015, and because these reviews are sort of, as a best practice, conducted every 4 years, we're overdue for one. There was a motion that was passed by council, by this group in September of 2023, and it supports our term of council priority of getting more people involved in decision-making and problem-solving to be handling advisory committees with a best practice lens. And there was the intent to align them with our public engagement policy, the new policy that was passed last year. So what have we done so far? Where are we coming from? What does this process look like? So there was the council motion that I mentioned before in September. And then we went and spoke with a number of municipalities. There was a scan of 10 municipalities to determine some of the best practices, some of the ways that engagement's being handled in other places, what direction they're taking with their reviews. And there was a focus on municipalities that had done recent reviews of advisory committees, looking at what the model should be. We worked with a consultant, SPRC, who led engagement with our voluntary advisory committee members, support staff, and members of council. There were high level of engagements from all three groups, and we got a number of need for change arguments from that work. We also did an inventory of the community tables and networks that the city currently consults with, looking over who we're talking with already, in what manner, in what bodies, and with what methodology. And then we collected, with the assistance of the clerk's team, data on quorum, attendance, what budget spends have been like, what budgets are allocated to which advisory committees. They look quite different, as advisory committees serve a variety of very different needs. We took this conversation about what this change would look like, because it was pretty significant, the changes we're recommending, to the senior leadership team. And we got broad support from the senior leadership team about the recommendations being made and how they might impact the city. And here we are today, talking to you fine folks at Audit, Finance, and Administration. And through the chair, I'm pretty proud of some of the work that's been done here. A lot of the analysis, it was very detailed and an enormous amount of research, and I'm not just trying to toot my own horn here. So what did we actually hear? First of all, we got a lot of feedback about significant need for change arguments around a number of key theme areas. One of them was meaningful engagement. A lot of people who were involved in advisory committees didn't feel like their feedback was being meaningfully heard through the process that they had. They didn't feel like reports to council were necessarily attended appropriately. They felt like they didn't understand the structure or the process, and it was very difficult to engage with. There were also issues around transparency. A lot of folks felt the first year or even 2 years of being involved in an advisory committee, which were often the years where there was the most appetite from council to be engaged with them and the most appetite from the community to care about what was happening, were spent learning how the system worked. And for folks who are not in regular positions of professional advocacy, this is really challenging, and the work can be quite difficult. There was also some issues around clarity. What is their role? How does it work? Even among staff liaisons, there was sometimes confusion around some of those issues. And it could sometimes be the case that volunteers were putting a lot of passionate energy toward a project that they felt stymied by what might be a bureaucratic process to an outsider. This led, I think, indirectly to some issues of culture. We had conflicts, we had challenges, we had folks who were perhaps deservingly frustrated by how things were being handled at the advisory committee level and turning that conflict internally. Because of the local board decision, advisory committees can be investigated formally by the Integrity Commissioner, and we've seen some instances where that's been the case. It's a very difficult and very public process for residential volunteers to go through. So this brought us to the conclusion that structural changes were necessary. We looked extensively at what kind of models could be council-directed, and in almost all cases, a council-directed model requires that in all cases, a council-directed model requires that the group be considered a local board, that they be subject to the same procedural limitations, that they have to move through the procedural bylaw, and that they have to do things like meet in open cameras, which can be an equity issue for certain community members. That meant we were looking really seriously at restructuring, doing something different, changing the model, because without changing the model, we're left with the same problems we had before. And while there were minor tweaks that could be made within the confines of that procedural bylaw, there were pretty significant issues that couldn't be changed. So what did we learn from some of this? Trends among other municipalities show that they're reducing the number of voluntary advisory committees overall. We're seeing pretty significant reduction in the overall quantity. Hamilton is a little bit of an outlier with the 14 that we have. It's a large number of them. This reduction in voluntary advisory committees has taken a couple of formats. In some places, they're being restructured as something akin to the Hamilton model we're suggesting of community liaison groups. They could also be just disbanded, as their mandates may no longer serve the city, or they may be duplicative of other work that's being done in terms of consultation. And they're aligning with better civic engagement best practices to more closely mirror where we want to see this kind of engagement work happening. We also learned that from other municipalities, training, orientation, and staff support was key to the successes that they had seen. We spoke with a number of folks across Ontario and across Canada about what was working well, because it's important to be able to come back with where are the successes. And one of those big places of success is when we were seeing significant support from staff. And again, I'm going to come back to this issue around local boards. I mean, the decision that came out of a court case that voluntary advisory committees and council-directed bodies would be considered local boards was significant in a number of the reviews. Particularly in the city of Ottawa, they called out the precedent as the reason that they're moving entirely away from this model and toward staff-directed groups, not unlike the recommendation that we're making. So what are we recommending? We're recommending the elimination of some advisory committees with profound thanks to the members for their contributions, but these are among the most poorly attended, ones struggling with quorum the most, or the ones that were not making choices around budget spend particularly, and where we saw duplication among other tables that the city is already consulting with. So we talked about how we're now funding the Hamilton Anti-Racism Resource Center, which was duplicative of a lot of the work that perhaps would have been conducted by the Committee Against Racism. We have positive relationships with the Circle of Beads, and we sit on the Hamilton Anti-Hate Coalition table. The Food Advisory, we currently have the Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, the Immigrants and Refugees Advisory Committee. Right now we have the Hamilton Immigration Partnership Council, which, while they work closely with them, a lot of the work is overlapping in some pretty significant places. And the Mundialization Advisory Committee is less that we have overlapping tables that we're consulted with, and more that we believe that work should exist in other places in the city, should be handled a little bit more directly. It had been 30 years since the city of Hamilton had a twinning agreement, and during the period of time where the Mundialization Committee was paused, there was actually work moving forward on potentially a future twinning arrangement. So some of that work is maybe not sitting in the best place that it could be. Further, we're recommending the transition of the remaining advisory committees to community liaison groups. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not intended to be a sledgehammer taken to the existing process. This is a restructuring. This is a transition. This is intended to be a plan about taking the work that's been done, which has been good work in a number of places, and making it easier for people, making it simpler, making the job more possible. Not requiring, equity-deserving community members to put themselves in positions of vulnerability, to be publicly displayed on camera and open to criticism, to align better with what we're doing well in the city of Hamilton in terms of engagement, to reduce barriers, and to be more directly integrated with staff work plans, to take the work that's being done by staff and have it better informed by community engagement, to be operating at a strong level of involvement and consultation, to be bringing in people to decision-making, as is one of this council's priorities. We also, we wouldn't be bringing forward a recommendation like this if we weren't also recommending increased training for staff, for people who might take on roles like chairing new community liaison groups. There's been some discussion about how those could look, and I need to emphasize that this is a recommendation to report back from a number of departments. We're looking to see tailor-made solutions. We're looking to see departments come up with what they think is the best answer for how a community liaison group could function for a specific community, which could look a little bit different in some places. So we're open to, with this recommendation, the possibility that this could look different for some groups than others. And it perhaps ought to, because everyone's needs look a little bit different. But we want to train members better. We want them to understand what they're doing. We want it to be possible for them to engage in this work without a kind of bewildering doubt that maybe they're doing something wrong or that they're going to get called out for something. So I've got a list here of the voluntary advisory committees we're recommending transition to community liaison groups and the associated departments that they'd be in. In almost all of these cases, the departments that they're moving into would be ones that already had existing staff liaison relationships. So we'd be working on existing capacity and working with people who were already familiar with these groups, who were familiar with their membership, who could handle, making sure that we were supporting them in a sort of a more seamless way. But the hope is to transition transition these groups in ways that, that preserve a lot of the work that they're doing, but have them more closely integrated into recommendations to make sure that they're not writing a citizen committee report that might be ignored because it doesn't follow a format that's useful to council, or it doesn't engage with the work that's being done by staff, but instead they're directly informing recommendation reports in ways that more agilely, more quickly, and more easily handle this process. They wouldn't be beholden to council for the ways that the budget spends occur. They would have a simpler time bringing forward the arguments and the work that they're trying to do. And it's the stated goal of the recommendation report here to make engagement easier, to make it simpler for the average individual. And thank you very much, everyone. Now happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a great presentation. So I also recognize that we have a report and several appendices, but I also do note that Councillor Spadafora has a question for Rebecca on the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. And first off, Rebecca, thank you for the presentation. The positive energy, genuine tone you brought to it really, it was really good. I enjoyed that. Question, you talked about other municipalities and how we are drastically higher when it comes to our committees. I think our number is 14. What is the number with like Ottawa or London or those other committees?
Well, in Ottawa, the number is 2, and they're both legislatively required. They're equivalent to ACPD, and they have an equivalent to a language advisory committee, are both required by legislation that's specific to the area. In all other cases, they've transitioned over to a model more like our community liaison groups. So they're consulting directly into staff relationships. In Kingston, they recently transitioned from having 10 down to having 7. There was some reasons why they wanted to hold on to some. A few were removed and replaced with other ones. There's an advisory committee on taxi fares. There's a number of places where these still kind of exist because this is a model we move away from slowly. Change is difficult, and you know it's not always easy for people to see the rationale behind it. But this is the trend we're seeing. This is what we're seeing from most municipalities. That, and I wouldn't say that Hamilton is necessarily a drastic outlier. You know, these are committees that have done good work from citizens who are passionate and care, but 14 is more than anyone we talk to.
Thank you, Rebecca, and again, great presentation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor M. Wilson, please, on the presentation. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Just echoing my colleagues' remarks, Rebecca, I always appreciate when you speak to this body or another committee because you are able to balance that professionalism with frankness and insight, and I really value that, so thank you. And all of you should toot your horn. It's been a lot of work, and I know it's not easy. I just want to make sure I understand, because I think it has implications. If you could further elaborate on the different capacities that residents have. They're all enthusiastic and genuine in their intent, but some are advocates, some are new to the city, some are new to English as a second language. I sat on the Immigrant and Refugee Advisory Committee. But how will the recommendations that you've alluded to in your report provide that baseline of an equitable start for everyone, through the chair?
Yeah, through the chair, absolutely great question, and thank you very much for asking it. I think it's important to know that everyone brings their own perspective to this work, and it's challenging. Some people who are advocates, who really have a bold case to make, find themselves stuck in an advisory capacity where their advocacy is not necessarily welcome and is not always the right approach to take. Others don't have the same kind of passionate understanding and background, and they might, as you say, have English as a second language or be not particularly familiar with municipal practices, and they may find the whole thing very bureaucratic and very challenging. And we've seen examples of this where folks have resigned early or they've left the advisory committee work because it's difficult, and it can be quite difficult. We're hoping that by bringing more training to the project and by integrating things more directly with staff and by taking things off the kind of in-camera, able to be investigated by the Integrity Commissioner, high pressure, high procedural environment, and putting it into a slightly more relaxed one, we're able to get some of the folks who might not be experienced delegates or might not be passionate, capable speakers who find this environment very comfortable. We're hoping to get some of the folks who aren't those people able to be involved in these kind of projects, because the term of council priority is getting more people involved in decision making. And that doesn't mean people who know how to advocate for themselves already exclusively.
Thank you. My next question then is making sure I understand the intent of, for lack of a better word, and please correct me, the next step of, if I understood you correctly, one of the rationale, one of the sources of frustration maybe for advisory committee members was they didn't know what was going to happen with their advice. And there was some confusion of the work of a department and the council direction that was given to that department, and then where the advisory committee was fitting in with the work plan of the functioning department, the priorities of council. So is this saying that we're going to tether it more closely to the work of particular departments so that that advice can be perhaps more, at least more successful in it being received? It doesn't necessarily have to be acted on, but there's more of an alignment there. I'm just trying to understand the next step and the rationale for what you provided, I think, on your second last slide.
Yeah, in the environment that we're talking about from a public engagement perspective, we're at a level where the promise we make to the people involved is that we will integrate the feedback that you have into the plan as much as possible.
Yeah.
So that's the hope, is by integrating more directly into staff work plans, to being more focused on the departmental needs. This isn't work that's going to be handled off the side of a staff member's desk, kind of liaising as effectively as they can with limited tools, but instead something that gets that real direct environmental support from the staff involved. I think it's hard sometimes to look at an example of an advisory committee in its first year with a lot of fresh energy and a lot of excitement and not think that's what they all function like. But the reality is that's not necessarily the case. And by bringing staff more closely involved into these plans, we think we can help tailor recommendations that actually bring the residential feedback to a more positive place around this circle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you. I think what we'll do is that we're gonna, so Councillor Taddison on the presentation, because we're gonna go, next step is the report and all of the appendices. Okay. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think what we'll do is we'll have you potentially sit at one of the microphones, so then that way we can continue to ask you these questions, but also because I do know that Clerk Trenham is online, as well as the potential SPRC people are also here. So it might be really great to get right into the report. Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation. May I have a mover and a seconder to receive this presentation? Councillor Crutch and Councillor Beattie, please. And then may I have your vote? Yeah, can you hang it like right there? Yeah, one of these microphones work. Perfect. Vote is up. Thank you, Rebecca.
Councillor Clark, you should be able to vote now. Thank you.
And that carries 8-0. Thank you. Let's put the report on the floor, please. May I have a mover and a seconder to put that on the floor? Councillor Taddison and Councillor Crutch. Any questions on the report? So the speakers list is open. I have Councillor Alex Wilson followed by Councillor Taddison. So Councillor Alex Wilson first, please.
Thank you. Just a quick sound check, Chair. I coming through okay?
Sounds great to me.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I just want to start off with some quick comments. I think the report does a really excellent job, and I just want to start there with identifying the existing problems and presenting them to us. So I think that I have no questions or comments on that. I think that's done a really excellent job. I also think the jurisdictional scan gets us exactly what we're looking for. And I also think our outcome statement, we want to engage more people, who we're trying to engage. We have to have a broader definition of that is, how we're trying to engage people. Like, I think our outcome statement, I'm also very clearly on board with. I think where I get lost or I have some questions is the methodology or the proposed recommendations in terms of how do we get to that outcome from where we are today. And that's, I think, the bit that I heard some questions from the delegate this morning as well. And I've been getting some emails and some feedback from community about that as well. But I just want to start by saying I think problems identified, yep, on the same page. Where we want to be, I'm also on the same page. It's the how we get there that I'm a little unclear on. And I guess that when this was shared in the presentation, but these are different bodies that have different needs. And I think my question is to the team that kind of did this work, I'm not sure necessarily who might feel they have the most to offer, is would the recommendation look different if instead we asked for a sliding scale of options for engagement? Or we said, for this specific committee, what would you be recommending? And I understand that's the next step, is to say that. But would we be getting a spectrum of engagement for a volunteer advisory committee makes the most sense for this group, but this works. But because we asked for one process for these 14 groups, that's the deliverable we got back, as one process for 14 groups. So just understanding how did maybe the instructions or the ask influence what came back from staff. We're getting kind of not a one size fits all for everything, but one size process, if that makes sense.
So there was two questions there. So the very first one was all about the process moving forward, or how we're doing that.
Sorry, I guess I'm asking, how did the ask of reviewing advisory committees specifically? So they were asked to review advisory committees and report back on options and how to change that, versus specifically asking the question, how can we best engage the climate group? How can we best engage residents on housing? How can we best engage that? Would we have got more than one answer? Like I'm saying, did we only get one model back because we asked for one model?
Okay, thank you. Project Manager Banky, please.
Happy to speak to that through the chair. It was requested in the motion that we report back on options inclusive of advisory committees. So we interpreted that as options. And I believe the community liaison group model is a good fit for the majority. Some of them we are recommending eliminations. There are different options. But I don't think the advisory committee model continues to serve well. I think it's a dated model. I think it integrates a lot of challenges. I think it might work well for people who are professional advocates. And if there was an environment in which we wanted to only foster the success of professional advocates, we might want to consider a voluntary advisory committee for that role. But the community liaison groups they're intended to be tailorable. That's why the recommendation is for a report back from each of these departments, because we believe that this is a broad and inclusive model that can really do a better job than what we're currently doing.
Okay. Counselor, in your second question?
Yeah, thank you. Through you, I think that helps a lot, because that clarifies it's not the activity. It's not the scope of the question that's determining the results back. Staff are standing behind, this is the recommendation for those options. Thank you so much. I understand that. I think the bit I'm not understanding is what happens if we as council want to both hear from professional advocates, to borrow the phrase, and the broader community on an issue. Does this model of community working groups allow for everyone to be heard, or does it balance who hasn't maybe been well heard now? And absolutely, we need to invite them in. I guess it's the only one approach bit that I'm struggling to understand, or we're moving from one model of engagement that's too strict and doesn't work to another one model of engagement. And I'm wondering, to what extent do we need a spectrum of engagement as part of this answer as well? And so just wondering, what happens if we also want to hear from those professional advocates and the broader community, maybe at the same table, maybe at different tables?
PM Banky, please.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Through the chair, I think the community liaison group is again, it's intended to be a flexible model that serves a lot of different kinds of needs. And the advisory committee model, it invites a lot of liability on its membership. And I think it's challenging sometimes to put people who, because of the restrictions around being a local board and the procedural bylaw, are not even allowed to be compensated with honorariums without a legal framework. It puts them in a position where they're open to a lot of vulnerability. So we're not recommending that we do some of one model and some of another, because we think there are fundamental flaws with the Voluntary Advisory Committee model that ought to be addressed. We're recommending, based on the research and the work that's been done, that the Community Liaison Group is a good model that serves well. And we've spoken extensively with staff, and we've talked to a number of folks about what that could look like. And for different departments, it could look quite different. And I'd like to suggest that the report back we get from those departments should help inform what they're tailoring things to do. One example that we already have in the city of Hamilton is we used to have a youth advisory committee, and now we have a youth steering group. And the reality was, for youth, 4-year terms didn't make sense. Being tied to terms of council didn't make sense. That not being able to do dynamic and flexible recruitment didn't make sense. They had a number of needs that were specific to the kind of group that they were, that served them very well under this alternative model. And while Community Liaison Group might seem like it's one solution, really what it is a myriad of possible solutions that all happen to fit under a similar descriptor.
Counselor?
No, thank you. And I think I'll just quickly say, I think part of the issue is we're not getting terms of reference back. We're getting a plan to bring those forward. And I think that's where some of the anxiety maybe from community members is coming from, or the concern is it's a plan to move in a direction, but not necessarily seeing what that outcomes looks like or those guarantees is what I heard this morning. So I appreciate that answer. Chair, I don't know where I'm at with time. If I have a minute for a comment, I'd take it. If not, I'm happy to.
Please do.
Okay, thank you, and then I'll be done. I think, for me, what works really well with the climate group personally is it's tied to specific action plans the city has, a climate action strategy, a biodiversity action strategy. I think I've seen other plans work really well when they are aligned with policy, and when there's not that policy overlap, I see more of the difficulty. I'm not necessarily seeing the tie to citywide strategies linked up, and I think that could come in a future report. I'm not saying it's scoped out by any means. I just think that's, to me, where those differences really come in, where we're taking that individualized approach for each group, figuring out the support they need. And my concern in what's being brought forward is the specific policy-based engagement and those policy-focused recommendations. I think the changes being presented are going to be great for the majority of work done in the majority of committees, but I think I'm just concerned about that specific type of work that some committees have been focused on. So happy to hear other speakers today, but that's just where I'm checking in at, Chair.
Thank you so much, Councillor Wilson. Up now is Councillor Taddison, and on deck is Councillor Crutch, Beattie, and Clark. Councillor Taddison, please.
Thanks to Councillor Wilson. He asked some of my questions and they were answered adequately. Just a few basic questions. It's my understanding that the Senior Advisory Committee, they're allowed to forward motions that come towards, that eventually get to council, or they go through a committee and then they would come to council. Do community liaison groups have that ability to forward motions that are of concern?
PM Banky, please.
Through the chair, our intended vehicle for community liaison groups is consultation with staff and recommendation reports that could come forward. We certainly want there to be feedback provided by these groups. We just think it might be better received by council ultimately if it's brought through that lens first.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Up now is Councillor Crutch. Councillor Crutch, please.
I can't speak to the item because I have a motion to refer this report back to staff, though I know that Councillor Beattie and Councillor Clark are on the speakers list, and so a motion to refer usually comes at the end of the first time speakers list, so happy for them to speak and then go at the end.
That's correct.
Thank you. So up now is Councillor Beattie, followed by Councillor Clark. Councillor Beattie, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Very happy with the report. Thank you for the presentation. Echoing the words of my colleagues. The concern that I have is with regards to recommendation AXI, and that speaks to the transferal of any reserve funding or surpluses that these committees have accumulated and kind of putting it back into the general tax stabilization account. and I guess my concern is specifically, Chair, with the Veterans Affairs Committee, Hamilton Veterans Committee, and it's based on my interactions that I've had with the committee over the past year that's been part of the installation of our new Remembrance Crosswalk in Stony Creek. The committee has accumulated a bit of a surplus, nearly $50,000. And in speaking to them, I know that they had, at least informally, anticipated or earmarked some of this reserve to support remembrance ceremonies and youth engagement under the kind of the backdrop, Chair, if we've seen national headlines recently that the capacity of our local legions is diminishing. And I think they view themselves as stepping into the breach to help support these remembrance programs and youth engagement and education commitments. So I'm trying to figure out, and I had a quick conversation with GM Zagaric about this, of possibly teasing out the Veteran Affairs Reserve and directing it in a way that would still enable the amount to be spent to support the remembrance ceremonies and the youth engagement and education piece. So I have kind of the loose workings of an amendment, and not sure, A, if there's a staff response, or B, at the appropriate time to move the amendment, and then knowing that Councillor Kretsch also has another motion, would be seeking some guidance from clerks on how to package this all together in an orderly flow. Hopefully that all makes sense.
Thank you very much, Councillor Beatty. I'm going to go first to GM Zagaric.
Through the chair, as I understand the intent and interest, it wouldn't prohibit the transfer of the reserves to the tax stabilization reserve, but if it's the will of committee and council to provide clarity as to how the remaining reserve balances may be committed in future years, if there are initiatives or investments that have been identified, is we can track that within the tax stabilization reserve. And so amending recommendation A, subnumeral 11, to include a commitment of, I believe it's 49,000 or thereabouts, towards Remembrance Day and youth education, veterans and remembrance services. That is an option.
Thank you. Councillor Beatty?
Okay. Thank you for that, GM Zagaric, and apologies to both you and members of committee that this seems kind of a last minute. It just kind of bubbled up to the surface, and I hate doing things on the fly like this. But with that said, a follow-up question then, if I might, Chair. In terms of the tracking and in terms of input from this soon-to-be reconstituted Veterans Committee into the new format, how is that amount, the 49,000 plus, how would that be monitored, and how would the new committee then be able to give input or understand what that balance looks like as the time marches on and things move forward? Just trying to seek the kind of the structural element of that.
Thank you. GM Zagaric, please.
Through the chair, staff can monitor that information and share that with the appropriate staff members to share with the committee. I'll make the comparison similar to any area rating reserves or minor maintenance project reserves or any board-specific reserves. So again, that information would flow onto staff who could share it to committee members. If committees put forward future investments, that is a potential funding source towards those investments until such time as those commitments are depleted. And then those committees would rely on either program reserves or reserves such as the tax stabilization on a go-forward basis.
Okay. Councillor?
Perfect. Thank you, GM Zagaric. And then my final question is that monitoring piece something that would be beneficial to include in an amendment, or is it kind of superfluous to the process?
James Agaric?
Through the chair, if the amendment to the motion included committed, just the inclusion of that word committed would direct staff to segregate those funds and then to allow for the monitoring and reporting of those segregated funds.
Okay, and then my legislative question then, Chair Huang, is with a proposed, I can't remember if it was a deferral or referral, on the horizon following my conversation or at the end of this conversation, seeking guidance from clerks as to what would be the best process to move this amendment.
I was just thinking the same thing. Clerk Bates, please.
Through you, Madam Chair, Councillor Beattie can move that amendment at any time. There's no restriction to when it happens in the process, and then it would be included if Councillor Kretsch is going to refer the item. The referral would be as amended.
So Clerk Turnham is nodding as well, so I think that seems to be in order. So, Councillor, your thoughts? What
Okay.
are you?
Well, I guess my thought, Chair, would be as to whether LC Bates has been able to kind of soak up through the conversation the intent and able to assist me with an amendment, or if we would go to the next speaker and then I can probably send her by email something a little more formalized.
I'm working on typing out what GM Zagaric has said. So if you want to continue the conversation and then come back to me, we can put that up.
Okay,
I
thank you.
Greatly appreciate that. Thank you, Chair. And that concludes my questioning.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to Councillor Clark. Then we might come back for the amendment that Councillor Beattie has before we go to Councillor Kretsch's referral. So Councillor Clark, please.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you. I'd like to ask, was there any consideration to leaving the committees as they are and changing the process? For example, when committees make recommendations to council or to GIC or whatever committee it is that they're making the recommendation to, that committee needs to respond to that recommendation.
PM Banky.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. There was quite a bit of consideration placed on the idea of retaining the model as it stands. I think barring significant need for change argument, the status quo is always the preference. And there were some small details that could have been amended, like not having things linger on the outstanding business list for as long as they sometimes do with citizen committee reports, and having that relationship be a little bit more direct. But there's still fundamental equity issues that wouldn't be addressed by those kind of changes, where we're restricted by the procedural bylaw or by the local board's ruling that affect volunteers who are being put in these potentially vulnerable positions. So while we thought about it for a long time, and initial drafts of the report even had that as a component of the recommendation, it was eventually decided that they would not address the kind of core concerns that our engagement had brought to the attention of the team.
So may I ask how many people that serve on the current advisory committees were consulted?
PM Banky, please.
Yeah. I didn't want to put you on the spot, Alana. Do you know offhand?
Sorry, come on down. And actually, I think that spot over here should have a working microphone. And before you answer, could you just also name an organization that you're with, please? So come on down. Do you want to just test that mic really quickly? Yeah, do you see the button?
Is this working?
Yes, it is.
So through the chair, my name is Elena Westervelt and I work at the Social Planning and Research Council. In terms of the engagement from volunteer advisory committee members, through the survey that we had originally sent out that shaped the engagement then moving forward, we had a response rate of 50%. So we had 56 of the 112 VAC members that were currently listed as being active participate in the survey itself. Then when we got to the focus groups that we then did following the survey with VAC members, we had 29 participants within 3 different focus groups.
Thank you very much, Alana. Counselor?
Thank you. And can I ask, was there any concern? It is a dramatic shift from what we have, Chair. There's no way of sugarcoating it. It is a dramatic shift. And instead of providing advice to counselors, these advisory groups are going to provide advice to staff with no accountability process to ensure that that advice to staff are then shared with council. And so I'm struggling with that because the current model could be clearly improved by changing the procedural bylaw to address the issues that were raised by the researchers and the folks that did this study without gutting that direct ability to share directly recommendations to the counselors. This is backwards.
Thank you, Counselor. I do recognize that Clerk Trenham has put his hand up. Clerk?
Thank you, Chair. And through you, sorry, just confirming you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Through you to the counselor. It's a good question, and I think it's important to recognize that this is still early as part of that process. I don't have experience with the volunteer advisory committees here in Hamilton. I have experience in previous organizations and have done something similar to this in previous organizations as well. What was done in my last organization with the City of Thorold was you create a policy with regards to that, so that if there is a meeting or correspondence or some form of collection of information done through the community liaison group, that needs to be documented by staff. And then as that item moves forward through council, that's an included section in the report. So here's what we did, here's who we met with, here's when we met, here's the advice we received, here's our recommendation. That can be part of that process. Depending on how the recommendations come forward from each department on these individual liaison groups, again, the process might look a little bit different depending on the group and the organizations that already exist in the community and how that best functions. And that's completely reasonable because we don't necessarily have a one size fits all, but we can apply some high level. This will look the same for everybody, such as the requirements when it comes back to reporting through staff and or what's posted online about these groups. So the fact that they exist and maybe who the appropriate staff liaison person is that's connected and working with them, so that's a little bit clear. There's lots of different ways to do this. This is still a little bit early. We're just suggesting that for these particular groups, we want to hear back from those departments on the best way to move forward with them. And council can certainly still apply more high-level policies like the one I just mentioned.
Counselor.
Thank you. I'll make some comments if I have time, Chair.
Yes, please go ahead.
I was not expecting a broad change from what Hamilton has done for decades to something that another municipality has done. I was expecting that there would be changes in the procedural bylaw to address the concerns that have been raised by residents serving on these committees. I believe the advisory committees serve a valuable purpose by directly sending their recommendations to their standing committee, which then get forwarded to council. This model, in my opinion, does not do that. This model insulates the committee from council. it creates this barrier to direct interaction with the council. I candidly, I'm not comfortable with this. I liked working with the advisory committees that I have served on. I was surprised that the Committee Against Racism is being recommended for dissolution. They have done remarkable work and continue to do remarkable work within the municipality. While I appreciate all of the work that was done to make these recommendations, I think it goes a little bit too far. And as it stands at the moment, I can't support it. As I said, I expected that we would be looking at the procedural bylaws and how to strengthen the advisory committees. I fear that this suggestion will weaken them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other first-time speakers to this? Seeing none, let's move on to back to Councillor Beatty on his amendment before we go to Councillor Critch on his referral. So Councillor Beatty, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Hopeful that Elsie Bates, I see her hand out all the way here in Stony Creek. I can see her hand come up in chambers. It's very remarkable.
I do have it ready. Do you have a seconder for your amendment, Councillor Beatty?
Looks like Councillor Pattison wants to second that for you.
Sure.
Okay, and so Clerk Bates, does committee want to see it on the screen, or are you good to read it out for us?
I'm putting it up on the screen anyway.
Thank you. So just that I'll read it out for public consumption, that Amendment A, subsection 11, XI, and it'll be moved by Councillor Beatty, seconded by Councillor Pattison, that reserve budgets remaining from advisory committees transitioning to working groups be transferred to the tax stabilization reserve, and that the transfer from the Hamilton Veterans Committee reserve of $49,058 be committed for future investments for Remembrance Day service and youth-specific education regarding veterans and remembrance. Okay, so I think that we're all on for that. And I don't think that there's any reason for debate unless it's debate on, I'm just trying to remember because there's a lot of procedural stuff. So Clerk, do we allow debate on this or no?
On amendments, yes.
We do allow debates. So are there any questions, concern, debate on this particular amendment? Okay, seeing none, may I have the vote, please? And the vote is up. That vote carries 8-0. Thank you, committee. Let's move on to Councillor Critch, please. Councillor Critch?
Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Chair. Sorry.
Yes, Councillor Beatty.
I wasn't able to push the button fast enough after that reset. And knowing that there is a motion that's going to kind of end conversation, I just wanted to have some parting comments on the report as a whole, if I might.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Just very quickly. And again, thank you to staff for assembling this. And I think what I've heard is that this intent is to enable more participation from, I don't know how to characterize it, from a broader base of participants, residents throughout the city. Whereas perhaps some have felt that if you didn't have an activist mindset, for lack of a better term, and I'm not meaning that to be disparaging in any way, shape, or form, that it was more difficult to participate in these committees. And so I think that there is some value in what's been presented here in opening it up in a way that allows broader based participation, and it's nice to see. And my battery's about to die, so I'm going to plug my computer in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Thank you, committee. Moving to Councillor Critch, please.
Thanks. My seconder for this is Councillor Alex Wilson, and I'm going to ask the clerk to put it on the screen, but I'll read it out. It's a referral that report CM 23025A be referred to staff for a report back with options for a future model for volunteer advisory committees that better delineates the roles and responsibilities of those committees, respecting support for citywide events on the one hand, because that's obviously a concern that people are thinking about, and advice given directly to council, so those being two separate activities, that ensure that advisory committees continue to be citizen-led and have a direct connection to council through which to offer their advice. I'd like to speak to the instructions, but I'd like some advice about exactly what I can say. The instructions are rather broad, so I imagine I could speak to the reason why, but...
Yes, you can speak to the instructions.
Okay. I'll be brief. The reason why I put it this way specifically is just because I think that it's important to separate the events bit from the actual other work that advisory committees do. Some advisory committees just do events, or primarily do events, I should say, and don't really have a function of giving advice to council, really. So I recognize it really in the report and all the work that's been done, which was excellent, that we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about the advice portion and how it gets from these committees to council. I also think the citizen-led part of this instructions are very important because up to now, these have been led by citizens. To have them be staff-led, I think just changes the flavor a bit and makes people feel like they're having a harder time. The reason why I put that specifically in there, and this was discussions I've had with anecdotally also, like Ian said, with many people who are on these advisory committees. The citizen-led portions was at the heart of why these were created in the first place. And there's some pretty wide reporting on how that happened and why there was a need for that advisory role. So I think it's important for the citizen-led bit to be there and there to be a direct connection to council. So to clarify, and I'll wrap up now, completely agree that the procedural bylaw is a barrier, creates all kinds of issues for equity-seeking groups and so on, totally. But I think we need an alternative for consideration in this report, and we don't have one right now. So this will allow staff to come back, take this into account, listen to what was said here, and provide alternatives, and then one of us could move an alternative in the future if we wish to do, and that's the purpose of this, because there's not currently an alternative for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crutch. Clerk, could we pull down the share screen, please, just so we can see the people? Councillor Maureen Wilson, please.
Thank you. I don't think I'm going to support the referral because I'm just trying to focus on the weaknesses and the opportunities that were uncovered by the consultation. And if I have...
Sorry, I'm going to stop you very quickly because I do see both Clerk Trenum and Elsie Bates trying to get my attention.
Of course. Yeah.
Through the chair, the referral itself is not debatable, but the instructions are.
So Clerk Trenum, I think you're just reinforcing that. Okay, perfect. So Councillor.
So, sorry, if I could just seek procedural clarity on that, which I always find a bit fuzzy. The content of the referral motion is not debatable.
The referral itself is not debatable, so if I can suggest that saying that you're not going to support the referral would be debating the referral itself. If you have questions about the instructions, then that would be appropriate.
Thank you.
I recognize Councillor Clark, followed by Councillor Beattie. Councillor Clark, please, on the referral and the instructions.
Thank you, Chair. So I have a question to staff. Is that permissible in this process?
If it's about the instructions, Chair.
About the sorry, Councillor Clark, you're asking for whether the referral is permissible, or I'm just trying to understand your question.
Well, the only thing that is before us is the referral.
Right.
And I have a question as to how staff are interpreting the referral. And I think that's fair for me to understand whether or not I'm supporting the referral.
Got it. All right, Clerk Trenum, please.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to the counselor. The way I interpret this is that it will not change the recommendations of the report, as these are staff's recommendations on going forward. What it will allow us is to provide some additional information in the form of a revised report that may be an appendice or just an additional section for alternatives that will speak to the comments in the instructions around whether we need to separate out events and what that looks like from advice and a true advisory capacity, and how that information could be used to allow some form of advisory committees to continue within that piece. So an advisory committee role separated out from any of the committees that speak to events. Again, I don't have the exact wording in front of me at the moment, but that's how I interpret it. So the report would come back as is, revised to include additional information based on those instructions. From that, when it came back to council, council would be free then to move an alternative, amend with or amend the recommendations of the report based on the additional information.
Counselor?
Thank you, Chair. So if I understand the clerk correctly, and I'm only asking this to, as you know, I like to paraphrase what I've heard, so I know that I've heard the proper thing. I think the clerk is advising us that this motion will leave the recommendations as to create liaison committees, and that the staff will review that recommendation in light of what this referral motion is asking them to do. And what will come forward will be a recommendation for liaison committees with some modifications.
I think that there would be additional information to the existing report. That's from what I understood.
Well, my question is to the clerk, because you, the chair, respectfully, you're not going to be doing the work. It's staff that are going to be doing the work, and I'm trying to understand how they're going to do the work.
Fair. Clerk Trenum, please.
So again, the way I would interpret this, we can't refer it back for staff to change the recommendations, because I believe based on the work that's happened, our recommendations aren't going to change as to what we think council should do going forward. However, based on these instructions, what we would provide is additional information to make it easier for council to really see an alternative that would allow volunteer advisory committees to exist in some capacity. I don't know what that will look like at this point, but we would take those instructions, provide additional information, so when the report comes back, there will be additional either alternatives or a recommendation that speaks to, if council doesn't want to go this route for X, Y, and Z, they could go this route instead. And then that makes it easier for council to make an informed amendment to what staff are recommending, rather than trying to make amendments right now with something that isn't status quo. Does that make sense?
Counselor?
Vaguely. So what I think I heard you say is that the staff recommendation to create the liaison committees will stand. You'll report back with some potential alternatives or additional language to strengthen the process.
Clerk Trenum is nodding yes.
Thank you. I still have my trepidations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Up now is Counselor Beatty, followed by second-time speakers of Counselor M. Wilson and Counselor Crouch. Counselor Beatty, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, I'm wondering if quickly the referral could be put back up on the screen. One of the limitations of participating virtually is that I have to disappear and vanish in order to see that for just a moment, because I do have a timeline question and I'm not sure if it's embedded in the instructions or not.
Clerk Bates, please. Okay. So just reading that out again, that report CM 23025A be referred to staff for report back with options for a future model for volunteer advisory committees that better delineate the roles and responsibilities of those committees respecting support for citywide events and advice given directly to council that ensure that advisory committees continue to be citizen-led and to have a direct connection to council through which to offer their advice. Councillor Beattie.
Thank you. So with respect to the instructions here, my concern is we're halfway through a 4-year term, and some of these committees have not been constituted or properly constituted or functioned in a manner, I think, that we had hoped. And the referral instructions seem to further delay, and I'll just leave it at that. So I'm not going to be supporting the referral.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Beattie. Up now is Councillor M. Wilson for a second time, please.
Again, my challenge is the second to last line on this referral. I consider it completely counter to the recommendations. So I'm struggling with the clerk's insight that this ultimately, we will be moving forward. Think what I heard, and you can clarify please for me one more time. The recommendations that are in this report will stand. Mm-hmm. The different divisions and departments will determine or help inform, given the nature of their work plan as directed by council, what that kind of liaison will work like to be more effective for the citizens. There's no suggestion that it wouldn't be citizen-led. And so then I heard the clerk say to the chair that there could be alternatives that are brought forward. Is the statement then suggestion that the alternatives would be counter to the recommendations, or how do we ensure that they are not counter to the spirit and intent of the recommendations through the chair?
So I'll ask Clerk Trenum. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. So in the report, you can see there's an alternative section for consideration. It was not really applicable in this particular case, but what these instructions would suggest is that the report come back with alternatives. So this is staff's recommendation. However, if council wish to go a different route, here's what those alternatives could look like. And those alternatives would be based on the instructions as written. Procedurally, what that looks like, when the report comes back, if a councillor moves the report as is, then the recommendations are what's on the floor for consideration. If council preferred an alternative, they can make either amendments that are not contrary, or they would defeat the recommendations and then move the alternative. But what's missing in the report at present is details on what those alternatives could look like. And my interpretation of the referral is to bring the report back with more information on what those alternatives may look like.
Yes, because that work is deemed to be outstanding and the next step as a consequence of the recommendation. I will not be supporting the referral. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Crutch, please.
Just wanted to clarify two things. The clerk had said that with respect to the instructions that it was about advisory committees. I put the word advisory committees in there, not because I was trying to maintain the status quo, but making sure the word community liaison groups is also fine. I was just putting a word in there to describe the groups themselves. So I just want to be clear. I'm not trying to suggest that we go backward to have advisory committees and not move forward with this model. I'm just thinking it has to be citizen-led. And to Councillor Maureen Wilson's point on debating the instructions, on page 9 of the report it says, and I'll read it out, for the remaining advisory committees, a recommendation is made around a shift towards staff-directed community liaison groups. So it's right in the report, and that's the reason why I'm putting this alternative here, is I think we need to have an alternative that's a bit more of a hybrid model that's not just saying advisory committees or community liaison groups, but is saying community liaison groups that are citizen-led. So that's why I'm asking for the alternative, and I think a professional way of doing this, instead of me coming forward with a sloppy amendment, is to get staff to actually review it and come forward with an alternative. So I'm not trying to move away from what we're doing. I'm just trying to get staff to do the work that they should be doing. And I think it's reasonable to ask for an alternative.
All right, thank you. I do recognize Councillor Clark, but I also have a question. So I'm going to, before I go to Councillor Clark, Councillor Spatafora, will you take the chair?
Go ahead.
I think the timing thing is a little bit interesting to me. So perhaps I can ask either the mover or to clerk when this potential referral would come back to AFA. Because I also note in the report that there will be additional report backs from all of the different departments, and it's inside of a one-year time frame. So I think I want to understand, before we actually move on to that particular work, when would that referral come back here?
Clerk Trenum?
Without being in the room to connect with my colleagues, I don't have a specific date in mind. Rebecca may be able to speak to it, but I would assume that we could provide some language relatively easily. I'm going to just float Q1 2025, but again, hand it over to others in the room.
Yeah, I think Q1 2025 sounds very possible.
Okay, well then that answers my question then.
Perfect, and I'll give you the chair back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On to Councillor Clark, please.
Hi, Chair. I'm not sure if the following question will be in order, so I'll rely on yourself and Clerk Trenum. I was struck that there were no alternatives in the report. Can someone comment on why there were no alternatives?
This is getting to be tough territory because actually we're here to talk about the referral and not necessarily on the report, because that's getting back to the report. And Clerk Trenum is nodding. So I'll have to say, could you rephrase your question?
I don't think there is a way of rephrasing the question to ensure that it complies with the clerk's ruling.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, at this point, we have a referral on the floor. It has been moved and seconded. And as we have heard, it should be coming back for Q1 2025. So may I have the vote, please? Vote is up. And that vote is defeated. We are now back on to, it's defeated with a 4-4 tie. And I feel like Clerk Bates wants to say something. No, not.
No, I don't, except for that the original report is now back on the floor.
Yes. Okay. So
So
now.
Councillor Clark can ask his question.
Yes. Okay. Councillor Clark, do you have a question that you need to ask?
Thank you, Chair. I've been pondering this, so yes, I do have a question I would like to ask. It is a little bit unusual to have a report come into a standing committee from staff with a recommendation that does not clearly identify alternatives. So I'm trying to understand why this report did not come back with alternatives or other options, just straight on, this is the way it is.
So I'll first ask PM or Director Chase, please.
Through the chair. The reason why we didn't include alternatives in this case is because, as Rebecca was talking about earlier, we did explore a lot of those alternatives through the consultation, but fundamentally we found that even if we started to make some of those minor changes to things like procedural bylaws, we were still challenged with the fact that it wasn't addressing what we heard from the consultation, which was that there needed to be a more flexible model and an ability to integrate those into staff work plans.
Thank you. PM, did you want to add anything else?
Only that a status quo alternative is always an option and never, presented in a staff report as an alternative recommendation. So that's certainly on the table, but we really do stand by the recommendations that are made here. A lot of research went into this, and we got a lot of buy-in from a lot of different parties. This affects a broad range of people at the city, and it was important to consult with quite a few of them.
Thank you, Project Manager Banky. Councillor Clark, did that answer your question at all?
It does. I guess the challenge that I have is we have presented a yes or no recommendation. And I don't think the intent was ever to gut the advisory committees. It was to improve them. And this is a completely different model. And while it may be helpful in other municipalities, I'm still struggling that there isn't a direct interaction with the decision makers. So a recommendation from the advisory committee for disabilities comes in and it's a clear recommendation and we need to deal with it. That should have been the model for all of the advisory committees so that we as counselors understand very clearly what the advisory body is recommending to us. I don't see that in this model. I see that happening going into staff, and it is fraught with challenges from that perspective because there isn't that direct accountability. So regrettably, I don't think I can support the recommendation that is before us. I think we should have been trying to clearly improve the model, the accountability, the framework. We have excellent people that are serving on these committees that are eager to provide advice to council, not advice to staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Up now is Councillor Alex Wilson, followed by Councillor Crouch. Councillor Alex Wilson, please.
Thank you. Apologies. I was hoping to do some of this at a later date. I feel now that we have to go through one by one, given that we're not there for the ones that are decisions happening today and it's not a referral for later. That's unfortunate. But alas, I think for B specifically, my question is the groups that are now being gone to the community supported groups and then Mundialization also gets put under there. Are any dollars flowing to support the community groups, or what is the relationship if we're relying on these external organizations that have already been carrying the mantle to continue carrying the mantle, not having the citizen group go in? The citizen group was maybe putting on an event, was maybe doing some function. I just looked at their budgets, couple $1,000s over the past few years for each of these activities. Those dollars are now going to back to the tax stabilization reserve. A question to that is what conversations have been had with the external partners who are going to be taking on this work? And is there any resources going on to support them in kind of continuing that mandate, understanding there was overlap already?
Director Chase, please.
Through the chair. So there has been conversation that has been happening with each of the volunteer advisories. They were part of the consultation and are aware of the recommendations. I know Rebecca's been having a lot of conversation in the last couple weeks with them. So in terms of budgets, we have recommended that those funds that are tied to these advisory committees where they would be community liaison groups would then be transferred to the staff department budgets so that they can support that work. The remaining funds, any reserve funds and those things would be then transferred to the tax stabilization reserve. I think there's certainly opportunity, as we know, to have further conversations with those organizations. The reason why these four in particular were being recommended to be disbanded is because we saw that there was duplication. So we can certainly have further conversations with those groups that we identified as duplicating some of the work around how they can continue to support the work that's going on.
Councillor?
Thank you. Appreciating that. I'm just maybe specifically to that last point, though, we can have deeper conversations with those about how to support that work. I'm just, what conversations have happened to date generally, and specifically has additional funding support been one of those topics of conversation for the external agencies, not the internal groups, but the external ones that we're saying do some of that work already?
There's a little bit of conferring on the bench right now. GM Zagarek, please.
Through the chair, if the councillor could repeat the question.
Councillor.
In the slideshow, 4 committees are being recommended for being disbanded today, not a deferral to get a report back later, but that's a decision happening today in Part B. I'm asking, of those, 3 of them, the rationale is because an external agency is duplicating that work. I'm asking what conversations have happened with the external agencies about this work and about this committee review, and is any funding flowing to those external agencies to support them now that we're relying on them to fulfill this mandate?
So through the chair, if a external organization sought financial support, they could seek it through staff, and staff can make a recommendation through future reporting to council with respect to financial support to the organization. They could request directly to council financial support, or if council chose to predetermine financial support, that could be an amendment to what's before committee today.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, my question is very, very specifically, and I appreciate the answers. It's just very specifically, have we asked the Hamilton Immigration Partnership Council and the other groups listed on the slide proactively? Are they able to fill this role? What support do they need to fill this role? Are they comfortable filling this role? Has that conversation happened? Like I'm aware we can do further support. I'm just trying to understand what has happened.
Director Chase?
Yes, through the chair. So there have been initial conversations, but I think explicitly have we asked them if there is additional funding support that's needed. We have not yet had those conversations, and I think we could certainly embed that as part of the implementation plan going forward.
Councillor?
Thank you. I have a similar line of questions about Mondialization, but rather than doing that, I'm going to get to the point of this, which is, could it be through you, Chair, I'd like to move an amendment that sees B get a little bit more on the track of A, which is not saying let's not move in this direction, but can we get some report backs that say what this is actually going to look like? What does the plan look like? In the same timeline that is being talked about for A, for the groups that are being transitioned, because even though we're winding things down, and I'm not necessarily saying, no, let's not wind things down, I'm asking that a transition plan also come for those wind downs, as we're talking about a transition plan for everything that we're getting from kind of what it looks like today to something else. And I'd be seeking to move an amendment to B that instead of making a decision when this gets ratified at council, we just get a little bit more line of sight as to what that transition will look like. Again, not trying to disrupt the direction, just trying to understand what it's going to look like, what supports might be needed. Bring some of that consultation forward before the decision.
Okay. Thank you. Director Chase?
Through the chair, so certainly if it was the will of council, we could report back with the transition plan on those committees.
Thank you. I see there's other folks on the speakers list. I'll leave it to you, Chair, but it's my intention to move that amendment today whenever it's appropriate for you.
Okay. All right. So I have made a note of that. So Councillor Crutch, please.
Now that we're back on the main report, I also will be supporting it. Pardon me, sorry?
No.
As
We're
amended.
gonna do the amendment after we have what? Sorry.
Councillor Beatty's amendment. So it's the
Yes.
main report as amended.
Oh, yes, main report as amended, and then there will be a second amendment from Councillor Wilson. So I just wanted to give first-time speakers like Councillor Crutch an opportunity to speak before we go back to the second amendment on said report. Councillor Crutch, please, sorry for the interruption.
Apologies for not using the words as amended. I'll get back to the beginning. On the main report as amended, I wanted to speak to this because I hadn't had a chance before because I was attempting to referral. Look, Rebecca and everybody else did a thorough review, a lot of research, and a great job. I agree we need to change the model, and I can see why we would perhaps not keep all the advisory committees in some instances. I understand why we may have some rationale for doing that. I think the majority of what was put forward is good, makes sense, will help to improve things. I think staff should be more closely aligned with this work. What I heard as the chair of an advisory committee was that they didn't feel there was a lot of support. They need more support in some ways. Sure, that's great. That support can still be citizen-led. I think what we're doing in Hamilton, even if it's somewhat novel, is important to continue. It's in some way, making sure there's that citizen-led support. And I'm going to read really briefly from an article published in 1998 before these came into effect, about some of the things that people wanted to see. And this is a councillor speaking, saying that he felt that one of the committees at the time had lapsed in somnolence, basically had become ineffective. Rather than battling the powers that be, it coasted along doing little more than organizing the annual events. He said, you can't make strides if you can't make gains if you're not prepared to take a stand once in a while. At the heart of why this started was to give citizens an opportunity to make these recommendations and provide advice to council in a transparent way, in a way that made them feel confident, in a way that built trust with the city, to say, hey, I can do this thing, I can have this exchange of ideas, we can do this together. To put it another way, I wouldn't be in this chair today without that system. Straight up. I would not be sitting here today without that system of engagement because I felt there was an ability to engage. I took that process seriously. I got involved and had those conversations. That experience was helpful to me in understanding, hey, do I want to be a city councillor? Thinking about wanting to do that kind of work. It was transformative. Having these be staff-led is not going to allow that to happen. I know many, many people who've resigned from these committees, personally, including people who didn't want to be in the spotlight and that's why they resigned. But the majority of the reason that people resigned from these committees, including letters that were shared publicly about this subject in the last term of council, were simple. I don't want to contend with the bureaucracy. Embedding this bureaucracy into the way these function is a mistake, in my opinion. Again, staff support is crucial, but staff leadership on a public citizen-led committee doesn't make any sense. And I think we're stuck in this binary where it's like, well, it has to be either council directed or it has to be the other thing. That's not true. There are many ways to come up with an option here that would allow for us to have a model of these new liaison groups operate, but allow them still to be citizen-led. Allow there to be citizen chairs, allow there to be an easy way for them to make recommendation reports to council without having to go through staff first. That extra having to go through staff first thing is the number one reason I heard from people is why they resign from committees. Number one. So I think going in this direction is not the right way to go. I don't also agree that all the meetings should be recorded or treated so formally and really take the delegates' comments from before to heart. There are some people who don't want to be in the spotlight in that way. It doesn't have to be an either or zero-sum game. We don't have to have it be that just because something is happening as an advisory type of committee that it has to be recorded. We can find a way to make this happen informally and still allow it to be citizen-led. And I get it. Hey, I was responsible personally for the court decision we talked about earlier. It's named after me. And so I get what we did here is made sure we talked about what local boards were. And that's important. We want to have that actual definition from the province to say, that's a local board, that's not a local board. I don't want this to have to be a local board. I think there are all these other options we can see across the country and across other countries where they do something effective, where citizen-led engagement can lead. So just want to say that I think this is excellent work. I really appreciate the work you've done. The research is really good. I just think the way that other cities are moving with this is not the right way to go if they're going to be having these things be completely led and directed by staff, and that we want to maintain, I think, something that we feel proud about in Hamilton, which is our ability to have these citizens be appointed by council, come forward, make recommendations, and have them be taken up in a way that's direct and feels meaningful to them. And that was the big thing missing from the last iteration of this, and this isn't going to solve that problem, so I won't be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Critch. I recognize Clerk Trenum, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment to speak to some of that a little bit. It is important for committee to understand that if a committee is created that advises council, if it reports to council or through a committee to council, it is a local board. So that's just first. So we must then treat it with the code of conduct, with the procedural bylaw. So that piece doesn't change. This change that we're recommending allows that feedback to come into the organization in a little more fluid way. And with the recommendations as is, with individual departments coming back on reports on how to implement this for that particular committee, or sorry, community liaison group, does not prevent an opportunity for more citizen-led work. Yes, the recommendations speak to a direction towards department-led. That is very heavily based on what we see happened in Ottawa as a great example. That's where Ottawa really made this move first based on some legal cases that they were dealing with, and a reason that a lot of this is happening in other municipalities. I very much recommend that we go this route because of that piece, And I don't think that the way the recommendations are worded would prevent the report backs from each department or division to include some more language around citizen-led opportunities. I can speak to other reasons that I support this. I don't want to go that route. I just wanted to touch on that fact that where a committee continues to exist and as an advisory role to council, even through a committee, it must remain then as a local board and fall under our procedural bylaw and code of conduct.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Crutch, please.
Thanks. It's my understanding that, I'll just make a proposal to you and see if you can understand the picture I'm presenting here. We could convene a member of citizens anytime we want, and those people could provide whatever kind of reports they want, and they could send them off to whoever they want, without us having to have a reporting model that directs them to be reporting directly to a standing committee or a council meeting. There is a flexible way of doing this, which does not require a reporting structure. We can mandate that there's a reporting structure, but we don't have to do that. So what I'm suggesting to you is not what you're saying, just to be clear. I'm not suggesting we have these committees report to anybody. What I'm suggesting is that there is absolutely a way for the city of Hamilton to support citizen-led committees through a recommendation process that is not a formal local board. Are you saying that that's impossible?
Clerk Trenum, please.
Through you, Chair, I'm saying that what we're recommending here is that. And while it is unclear, because this is new for the city, I get that. This is a big change. This is a conceptual change, and conceptual changes are hard. But in the situation where our past is that members of these advisory committees can create and I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment, but a community written report or something along those lines, that could still happen. That could still happen through this process where that report is written, provided to staff, and the policy be that any reports written by these community liaison groups are appended to staff reports coming forward, so that that information can still come through, that you can see the work that these people have put into it, even though it's coming through a department. I'm not saying that can't happen. That can certainly still happen. It's just the direction that staff are recommending to manage this is through currently a department-led route. And that's where these reports will come back to explain how that can look for each department and for each committee, because there may be some minor differences depending on the committee and the group and the groups that work with the department staff. That there's going to be a little bit of variance. But we can come back with our report back as well that also includes what do the high-level policies we want for all of this to be. Maybe it is that we want to ensure an ability that anything written by a community liaison group chair must be included in staff reports so that that information is accessible to council. We can do that. We can absolutely do that. We have a lot of opportunity here to write what this looks like and to ensure that you're still getting the information you need to make decisions.
Thank you, Clerk. Before I go back to Councillor Crutch, I'm just mindful of the time. It's at 11:30 right now, and we do also have ECS happening at 1:30, so just wanted to lay that out there. Councillor Crutch, back to you, please.
Thanks. Last comment for me. I wasn't intending to get into debate with the city clerk today, so that's not my goal here. I'm fine with change. I asked for this change loudly. It's not about that. What it says on this page 8 of this report, and maybe what you're saying now is maybe you're willing to reconsider this, and which would be helpful, but it says on page 8 of this report, the groups are chaired by and called to order by departmental staff. So I'm just reading the language in front of me in black and white, and that's what it says. Now you're saying, well, there's these chairs of these committees and maybe they can write a report. So now you're suggesting the chair could be a citizen? Great. Like what I'm literally trying to get is at that point. So I'm reading what's in black and white here, and that's what I've been responding to, nothing else. And so my concern remains that we do not have a structure here that says these will be citizen-led. It is not what you're saying in the report. So I'll leave it for the report to come back. And if when the report comes back and we look at the nuances for all these different committees, it ends up being something different than this, maybe I'll support that report. But as of today, it says that these will be chaired and called by staff. That is a huge barrier to the public because that means staff control when people meet and when they don't meet. And that's not appropriate. and that they're not going to be chaired by actual citizens themselves, which is an important part of this, and keep skill building for people who want to get more experience in municipal government to be able to do this kind of work. It's so important for people and for our citizens to be able to have these skills and build these skills. And the advisory committee has been a home for that for decades. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Crutch. Up now is Councillor Clark, please.
I have served on council, on community liaison committees, on advisory boards and boards of directors. I have not found liaison committees in the manner that we're proposing. I am truly troubled by creating advisory committees, in essence, that are led by staff. I don't think the residents and the communities that were involved want their advisory committee to be led by staff. In fact, they were saying less bureaucracy. This creates more bureaucracy. I have been involved in committees where staff clearly disagreed with what was being proposed. If it's a staff-led process, then how are we to have the comfort that the objections or the positions of the community liaison committee itself are being properly explained to the standing committee or the council? We have fought hard this term to create transparency. Transparency in this recommendation, in my humble opinion, is going out the window. This process creates basically backroom meetings with citizens and then staff reports to the standing committee. That's not what an advisory committee is supposed to be. An advisory committee is supposed to be free to provide advice to a standing committee on any matter. And on occasion, council can direct specific things to the advisory committee to contemplate and give recommendations. I don't feel that these liaison committees, as it is being proposed here, is doing that. And I don't think those that are involved in the community are going to be comfortable with the process where they're presenting their information to staff, staff's leading the process, staff does the reporting, staff makes any recommendations. We need the process to be fully transparent. And finally, on a closing note, Chair, this is the first time in any meeting that I've been involved with in my terms on council where I felt like I was debating the clerk. Just want to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. We are now back to Councillor Alex Wilson on the amendment, please. Councillor.
Yeah, thank you. Buffering for some time just because I think me and LC Bates have been going back and forth, but just the intent is just to have the recommendation be read that staff report back with a plan to disband these committees and the volunteers be thanked, as opposed to just saying that they be disbanded and the volunteers be thanked, just adding the words that staff report back with a plan. To do that, I do think it's important to have some of those transition pieces, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Does committee need to see that on screen? Yes. May I have it on the screen, please? We're just putting it up on the screen. Okay, and it reads in the bold that staff report back with a plan to disband and then the following advisory committees and then reworked, blah, 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 blah. Any questions on this amendment? Councillor Clark, I think, is waving. Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Chair. I know this digital system that we have when we're at home, the microphone does not always flash right through to you. So I just wanted to get your attention, and I didn't mean to be rude by waving at you.
No worries.
Pardon me, Councillor Clark, Madam Chair, I don't believe we have a seconder for the amendment.
Right. Is there a seconder for this amendment? Councillor Maureen Wilson will second.
Thank you, it's appreciated.
And Councillor Clark, back to you.
Thank you. So I'm struggling a little bit here. I don't support the disbanding of these committees. And by voting to support this amendment and this policy, that means I'm supporting the disbandment of these committees and supporting that they get letters of congratulations. Of course, I expect that we would send out letters of congratulations, but I want to put it on the record that I don't support the disbanding of these committees. So while I support the recommendation to send out notes of congratulations and some way to thank them, I still don't believe that these committees should be disbanded.
To Clerk Bates, please.
Through the chair, when we get to voting on the main motion as further amended, assuming this amendment goes through, you can lift item B and vote on it separately.
Thank you, Clerk. That gives me some consolation. I'll support the amendment as proposed by Councillor Alex Wilson.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions, concerns, comments on this particular amendment? Seeing none, we have a mover and a seconder on this particular amendment only. And may I have the vote, please? We're still just waiting for the vote. Oh, the vote is up now. And that vote carries 8-0. We are now on the main report with 2 amendments. I did also kind of hear very quickly that B will be lifted as a separate vote. So perhaps we'll do B first and then the whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle with the amendments. So we'll start with B, and the vote is up. Just B. If you voted wrong, please let clerks know, so then that way. Okay. And that carries 6-2. So now we are on the entirety of the report with the 2 amendments, but we pulled out B, which was already amended. So it was the whole report.
The balance of the report.
Yes,
So
the balance of
A,
the report.
then whatever comes after B, C and following.
Okay, and we already had a mover and a seconder at that point, right?
Correct.
All right, so let's vote on the balance of the report, please. Vote is up. And that vote is defeated 4-4. I guess we will continue to move on in the agenda. And the current, where we're at now is 8.2, the Fraud and Waste Annual Report. I'd like to call upon Auditor General Charles Brown and Bridget Menard, Deputy Auditor General, to please come to the podium and begin your presentation. Also, thank you, Alana from SPRC, for being here.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I am Charles Brown, Auditor General, and I'm joined by Deputy Auditor General Bridget Menard to present our 5th annual Fraud and Waste Report during this week, which happens to be International Fraud Awareness Week. The purpose of our report is to provide an overview of all the whistleblower fraud and waste matters that came to our attention during the year, which in our case, it ends June 30th, 2024, because we started the hotline July 1st, 2019. We've carried each year from then. Next slide. As you know, the hotline is a confidential and anonymous service that's independently operated by a third party, which members of the general public or employees can access by phone or online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to report suspicions of wrongdoing or make complaints about government waste and inefficiency. By encouraging citizens to report concerns, it can help the city improve operations and be more efficient, effective, and transparent, and build trust and confidence in city government. Bridget?
Thanks so much, Charles. So I'm going to go over the key statistics from the report. So we received 127 reports in the current reporting period. It is a decrease from 159 in the prior year, but is still the second highest number of reports ever. The volume has bounced back since July. We are currently experiencing a high volume of reports. We've received an additional 67 reports since June 30th alone. It is on track to potentially be our highest calendar year report ever. Substantiation rate is 33%. The previous 2 reporting periods were 31 and 32%, so this is remaining fairly consistent. Our substantiation rate is in between Toronto and Ottawa. Toronto had a substantiation rate of 21%, and Ottawa had a substantiation rate of 46%. This substantiation rate is calculated as the percentage of reports that were fully or partially substantiated in the current reporting period, plus any carry-forward cases. In-progress cases are included for this number, and then in the reporting period that they are concluded, they are included in the substantiation rate for that period. One of the questions that we get are what are the most common types of reports that we receive. This year, the most common was reports about social services, fraud, or wrongdoing. Second was service complaint and concerns. And then third was multiple categories applicable. So multiple categories applicable mean that there could be an allegation of fraud and misconduct, or fraud and waste, or fraud and a service complaint concern. You get the idea. The top 3 categories have remained static the past couple of years. The order flipped a little bit this year, but this is pretty consistent with what we have seen. Moving on to the next one. So one of the questions we also get is what proportion are employee reports and what proportion are reports from non-employees. So this reporting period, 46% of reports were self-identified as employees and 54% were non-employees. This has remained relatively consistent. Usually it is just under 50% that is reported by folks that self-identify as employees. So about 2/3 of the reports were directly received by our fraud and waste hotline provider. That's the third party, the 1-800 number. You can submit via email or online via form. And then about 1/3 of them were received directly. So that means that they were received directly by our office via our inbox, via telephone call, or we received some reports from management in finance, human resources, procurement, et cetera. So of the direct reports that we received, about 60% of those were directly from management. And these are typically folks that have a really good understanding of their obligation under the organization's fraud policy and protocol to report to us. And we are pleased that folks do continually reach out to report those things to us as they are required to do. What did we do with the reports? So for the 127 reports that we received, 12 reports were launched into investigations, and then we had one additional investigation that was launched from a prior period report. Of those 12 investigations, or sorry, the 13 investigations, we had 2 fraud investigations, 6 waste or mismanagement investigations, 1 combined fraud and waste investigation, and 4 whistleblower investigations. We also referred 63 items to management for their review and investigation with a report back required to our office. We then evaluate if we think that the investigation was done sufficiently, and if we don't have that opinion, we might ask for some additional work, or we will take the investigation on ourselves. There was an additional 12 items where a referral was made without a report back required to our office, and another 40 items where the report was out of jurisdiction, did not contain enough information, or just did not require a response by the Office of the Auditor General. So when I went over that substantiation rate of 33% earlier in the presentation, we're breaking it down a little bit further. So overall, we handled 162 reports. We've got 42 in progress, 29 were substantiated, 10 partially substantiated, 23 unsubstantiated, and then we had 58 where it was not applicable. Not applicable means that there's not enough information, it's not in jurisdiction, and it's just typically not fraud or waste related. So the outcomes, this is usually what is of most interest to folks each year when we do this report. So this year, and this is all based on what Human Resources reports to us. So there were 5 terminations, and then there were 10 other actions taken. Other actions taken include employee resignations, retirement, discipline issued, non-disciplinary letters issued, verbal warnings, or repayment letters. Overall, there was $2.35 million of loss or waste or mismanagement substantiated since our last annual report. Of that, $863,000 was fraud and $1.485 million was waste, with $11,500 in recoveries. You might ask, why are the recoveries so small? That is actually a very typical number. Typically, recoveries are a minuscule amount of the losses that are incurred by an organization. If the number seems like a larger than usual number, it is a larger than usual number. So cumulatively, in the first 5 years of the hotline's operation, $3.64 million of losses or waste have been substantiated. So overall, 65% of that total was within the current reporting period that we are reporting today. And then cumulative recoveries since the hotline launched, $47,400. I'll turn it over to Charles, who'll go over some of the key case examples that we encountered this year.
Thank you, Bridget. So our report contains examples, abstracts or summaries of the allegations that we investigated, and I'll briefly describe some of them. In one case we investigated, there was a complaint about an employee who was working at another job, specifically about how this other employment could potentially be in conflict with city duties. Based on our available evidence, we substantiated there was overlap in dates and times, that the employee was actually performing duties for the outside employer, and when they were supposed to be performing duties for the city. The other example is a complaint about the administration of real estate leases and licenses, and this was a complaint that launched what we call a spontaneous audit, which we very recently reported to this committee, which led to 35 recommendations for improvement, particularly in regard to enhancing rent collection and avoiding losses from arrears. Next. In one case, there were 12 instances of time theft that were evidenced by falsification of work service records. In addition, there were 3 instances of substantiated false benefit claims totaling 14,300. Not as many as last year, but still 3. Also, if you recall, in last year's annual report, there was a case where an imposter posed as an existing vendor to the city and asked to have their banking information changed for the banking information for electronic deposit, have that changed. And this was a scam and resulted in the diversion of funds payable to a legitimate vendor, diverting that to the imposter, and the loss in that case was $52,000. This past year, we investigated 2 more instances of this same scenario. In the first instance, the funds diverted amounted to $274,000. And in the second instance, over $552,000 was transferred to an imposter's bank account. Through court orders, we were able to trace the flow of funds to different financial institutions. And on this second example, with the assistance of legal services, we managed to freeze $417,000 of the $552,000 in funds that was sitting in one of the institutions. Next slide. We had a complaint from a vendor that they were treated unfairly in the assignment of work in violation of a contract. Our investigation substantiated the complaint, and the city compensated the vendor for their loss, approximately $22,000. We had an issue we investigated, which will be in our upcoming transfer payments audit, in which there were 10 duplicate payments due to human error, and that was a total overpayment of $18,400. Our office received a citizen complaint about a capital project that resulted in 4 recommendations to improve contract management and oversight of contractors. And we also investigated overbilling by darts that has taken place over at least a dozen years. And this complaint caused us to initiate another spontaneous audit. And that report, you will see, it's expected to be released in December. There was one incident reported to us by corporate security of a stolen van, estimated value $13,000, and it was reported to police and was communicated previously to council in one of our serious matters reports. Also, a citizen complained to us about new positions that were created to manage federal government program funding for a city program, and the concerns were about the need and value for money obtained from these new investments and the overall process, questioning the process, specifically lack of a business case and justification. So in this case, we determined that the added costs of these positions did fall within the allocation benchmarks of the federal program, so it would in fact be fully funded externally. But our follow-up on the particular concerns about lack of a consistent process led us to more corporate observations and conclusions that business case justification for staff complement increases could be more robust and strengthened with corporate guidance, and we delivered a memo to that effect. So one of the things we like to do is kind of reflect, look back on the year's activities with the hotline. And I would just point out for your information what stands out. for us in this year's activity. Well, obviously, one of the big ones is the significant losses due to vendor imposter frauds. That continues. That was an issue last year, and it continues, of course, this year. Conflicts of interest continue to be challenging to address. Our overall high volume of reports continues. As Bridget said, it's the second highest year ever. Still beyond the expectations when we came up with the idea and of having a hotline. Poor contract administration and oversight continues to be a frequent issue. I just articulated some of them. The not following the contract, which cost us $22,000, the city $22,000, the duplicate payments, the city capital project, and the contract overpayments to DARTs, examples of that. And finally, the need for continued vigilance with respect to cyber fraud in particular and employee benefits fraud. We did have the experience this year of a cybersecurity incident, and we were affected by that. It interrupted for several months our audits, but what we decided to do was to audit the processes that were being used as workarounds, because we wanted to make sure that those new processes would not have an exposure, and we delivered a report to management. One of the new things that we've done this year, if you look at it, it's Appendix C. I draw your attention to it because this is a new item that we've added to our report, and I would like to continue to bring this information forward. And it really flows from a question that we got at last year's annual report. And the question was about, well, what happens with the recommendations that we make to management directly in management letters and so forth? How can we receive that information as councillors? So for that reason, I've decided to add this summary of the recommendations. You can see that there are a considerable number that we deliver through the course of the year at the finalization of our investigations, in this case 104 recommendations. And all of these are stemming from complaints, either from citizens or employees. So with that, I'll wrap it up and prepare to answer questions.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on the success over this past year, and thank you for all the hard work that you do. On the speakers list currently is Councillor Clark.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Chair. If you will indulge me, I'd like to make a few comments that we had talked about at the last audit.
Oh, yes. Please, City Manager.
Appreciate that. So thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to speak, and through you. First, I want to acknowledge the work of the Auditor General's Office and those that support them. Their efforts help us to promote transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement, and I think they're essential to building trust in how we manage the city's resources. The 2024 Fraud and Waste Annual Report is always a strong reminder to us of why tools like the Fraud and Waste Hotline are so important, because they allow us to address issues directly and maintain the trust our residents place in us. Whenever there is loss or waste like this, of course we are regretful for that and apologize, because we take our responsibilities to the public extremely seriously. Fraud and waste are not just financial issues, they strike at the heart of public confidence, and the report highlights areas where we need to do better, addressing challenges like cyber fraud, conflicts of interest, vendor imposter fraud, contract management, and benefit fraud, to name some of them. But I also want to assure you that we're taking these findings very seriously and have already moved forward with many of them. So don't want to leave the impression that all of those remain outstanding. Of the 104 recommendations, many are underway. We're strengthening our policies and procedures so we can better detect and prevent cyber fraud. We've been improving training for staff on the code of conduct, on ethical conduct, outside employment, and conflicts of interest, enhancing oversight and due diligence. We know we need to do that on contracts, and staff have been working hard on it, and reinforcing a culture of accountability and integrity at all layers. So those are some of the things we're doing and will continue to do. So We're committed to learning and improving and building on this work, and residents and council should feel confident that we will act on the Auditor General's recommendations and track our progress. We're taking it to senior leadership team too, so we can build on that learning and have it be exponential across the organization. So where we've learned in one area, we can apply that in other areas too. So I just want to acknowledge the incredible work of our city staff too, who work very hard at making sure that when we find these things, we find solutions to them and help prevent it from occurring again. So their dedication to upholding our policies and serving the community are at the core of our ability to deliver. So finally, the Fraud and Waste Hotline has proven to be a really strong cornerstone in our efforts to ensure accountability, to give both employees and the public a safe, confidential way to report concerns, and its success reinforces why this tool is so critical. We will continue to build on it and express our gratitude to the Auditor General.
Thank you, City Manager. So we do have a speakers list. We'll start with Councillor Clark, followed by Councillor Taddison. And just to let committee know, because we are on a bit of a timeline because of emergency community services coming up at 1:30, I have asked Sal to put a clock on all of our speakers. So just wanted to let everyone know ahead of time. So Councillor Clark, please.
I thought we had a clock on all of our speakers all the time. A question with regards to Appendix C listed a number of recommendations, which I believe the city manager was just referencing. I guess the question would be to the Auditor General, is there an intention to do much like we do with city audits, where there are recommendations made by the auditor and management must respond to those recommendations, and council gets a report of that in that manner? Are we going to do the same thing with Appendix C?
So with that, as I explained, it's a new process that we wanted to implement this year. And as part of that, what I propose to do is to bring those recommendations back to council by way of a follow-up report that would be done periodically. I don't know if we can manage to do it annually, but that and all the audits that we've done in this term of council and the previous term of council, we've discussed it internally as a team, and for having that kind of accountability so that there would just be in one report a status report or completion report explaining all the recommendations from the various audits, including all of these memos, so that would be all contained in one report. I would hope we could get to doing it annually, but I don't want to commit to it until we've tried it once.
That sounds fair.
But that's the idea, to have some sort of periodic bringing back and follow up to bring to AFNA and ultimately council.
Thank you. Councillor Clark, please.
Perhaps I could suggest that the Auditor General and the City Manager a conference in terms of how this information is going to come back to council. These recommendations, some of them are quite serious and they need to be addressed. And without some type of report coming to council, we don't know that they have been addressed. So I'll leave it at that in terms of having the city manager look into it. If I may, Chair, I'm just trying to find, so I'm on now Appendix A.
Okay.
And Appendix A.
Before I get there, I wonder if it's okay with committee that we'll also talk about the report, and then we'll receive both the presentation and the report together, just so that we're all clear. Okay, please continue, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. That makes complete sense to me. In Appendix A, on page 7, at the very top, it talks about, since the launch in July 2019, the cumulative total and actual potential losses investigated is approximately $3.6 million, with $47,000 being recovered. Can I ask the Auditor General to touch on this point and highlight so that the public has an understanding in terms of we're not throwing away $3.6 million. There's some legitimate issues in terms of how we recover such money.
So through the chair, it's important to understand that that loss is not necessarily money fraudulently obtained. Some of it is estimates of waste. An example of that would be the $22,000. If the contract had been administered appropriately, the contractor would have received what they normally get. We wouldn't have to pay someone else, as well as the contractor who should have gotten the work, an extra $22,000. So there are things that arise from process, but then there are other things that arise from fraud. So I think that's one important point to make. The other thing is the actual fraud this year. It was a substantial number, obviously, with the amount of estimated loss this year. The biggest, I think, the two biggest chunks of that were 878,000, or I think 800 and something thousand, with respect to the two frauds. And then there was also the 1.2 million in potential losses from arrears from the real estate issues. That covers off most of it. The rest are smaller amounts. And I think the councillor is right, because in the sense that the public needs to be assured, what lessons have we learned? So what lessons have we learned? Well, there are memos that we issued with respect to, and there are reports that are, because some of these investigations are still ongoing, that have recommendations that go to management, and that's the reason for Appendix C. But then there's also the spontaneous audits. More and more, I like that idea of bringing it to council. When I say spontaneous audit, by the way, I mean it's not on the audit plan, but I do have the discretion to immediately launch an audit if there's some serious matter that I think needs to be addressed. And that's what I call a spontaneous audit. And more we're seeing those, as we did with real estate, with the DIRTs and so forth. So I think by particularizing the findings and recommendations with a public report with that, perhaps there's more overlap, but at the very least, I think there's greater accountability with bringing those types of audits forward. So I hope that partially addresses what the councillor is saying, and I'm certainly welcome to hear any other ideas.
Thank you, Auditor General. I know we're already at the 5 minutes, but Councillor Clark, do you have a last question?
Quick statement and then a last question. I would like us to contemplate the Auditor General reporting directly to council, much like the Integrity Commissioner reports are. The last question is with respect to page 12 of 30 on Appendix A. It indicates that the vast majority of the reports of the office to the Auditor General received do not qualify as whistleblower matter due to the fact that they come from residents or employees that wish to remain anonymous. Can you just explain that, and what happens to their report? If they're not qualified as a whistleblower, does that mean that there's no investigation into the allegation? Thank you. That's my last question.
So through the chair, no, it doesn't mean there's no investigation. It simply means that the city cannot afford whistleblower protection to that person. So.
Oh, I understand. So the protection from the policy where if you are a whistleblower and you're coming forward, then you've given us your name, we know who you are, but we then protect your identity. Is that correct?
Exactly. Further to that, there are specific criteria that have to be met for it to be, quote unquote, a qualifying disclosure to us. And one of the criteria is the fact that, at least to us, the person has to be known. We have to know who that person is. And that's more of a practical thing anyway. I mean, if you're a whistleblower, if you're getting reprisals against a whistleblower, then pretty hard to remain anonymous.
Yes.
I just want to thank the Auditor General for all of his work. It's an excellent report, but equally depressing that we continue to have fraud and waste. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Up now is Councillor Taddison, please.
In echoing our city manager and Councillor Clark, thanks so much, A.G. Brown and your team. I really appreciate the level of accountability and transparency your office brings to our city as we try to deliver value for our taxpaying public. In your presentation, you said one of your resultant actions was 5 terminations and then 10 other actions. One of those actions was retirement. So I'm trying to understand, when you say retirement, is that a forced or optioned retirement? Are there actions taking out beyond a regular retirement, or are there penalties to this employee or public disclosure? Like, what happens? Do they just get to retire quietly and we send them off?
So through the chair, thank you, Councillor, for the question. So the Office of the Auditor General is an independent fact finder. So we do our investigation and then we report our findings to management and HR. And then they inform us of what actions they have taken, including retirement. So we're not really involved in that particular process. We just provide the facts from the investigation, and then we diligently track all of those statistics for our annual report. So I don't necessarily have any insight into that particular matter. That's the information that we received from HR.
Could I get an answer from the city manager?
Through the chair, thank you. I'm cautious when speaking about things because I don't want anyone to try and figure out who the individuals may be. So if you're okay, I won't answer that one directly.
I'm okay with that from a legal stance. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers to this particular report? Thank you to both the Auditor General and the Deputy Auditor General. May I have a mover and a seconder, and they will be for both receiving the presentation and the report. So Councillor Taddison.
Pardon me, Madam Chair, if we could do that in separate votes, please, as they belong on separate parts of the agenda.
I see, sorry about that. So receiving the presentation, please, Councillor Spadafora and Councillor Taddison. May I have the vote, please? Vote is up. Vote carries 7-0. And now on the report, also same movers and seconders, so Councillor Spadafora and Councillor Taddison. May I have the vote, please? And the vote is up. And that vote carries. Thank you. We are now moving on to consent items. So the first is 9.1, Auditor General, you're back up here. You're reporting on serious matters to council, and the case is number 78878, AUD 24007, and the actions here are to be received. So I'll ask committee if you need any overview, or if the Auditor General would like to speak to this particular item. Auditor General?
Through the chair, I'll just briefly summarize what this was. The reason it was being reported as a serious matter, because it meets one of the criteria, that being it was reported to police. And this was an example where someone passed counterfeit money to the city. And perhaps I can say this, that I think Customer Service Division is to be congratulated because they immediately dealt with it they have a process for this and their procedures. They caught it and reported it to the police and then to us. So my hat's off to them.
Thank you, Auditor General. GM Zagarek, please.
Yeah. Through the chair, if I can just thank the Auditor General's Office for their comments, complimentary comments towards staff. I too want to recognize staff. We train staff as part of their onboarding and their regular training with respect to recognizing counterfeit funds. In this case, the staff person segregated the funds to ensure that they didn't continue to flow through and inform the Auditor General's Office and Corporate Security. So just extending my thanks to staff for following procedures and for ensuring that the fraudulent funds did not continue to circulate.
Thank you, GM. Any comments, questions on this particular consent item? Seeing none, may I have a mover and a seconder to receive this item? Councillor Taddison, Councillor Clark, please. And may I have your vote? And the vote is up. And that carries 7-0. Thank you. We are now moving on to discussion items. Director Nick Winters, you've been a champ up there. We're going to talk about the stormwater asset management investigation of recent sewer leaks. Director Winters, would you like to start us off?
Certainly. Nick Winters, Director of the Hamilton Water Division, and through the chair. Speaking of audit reports and management actions, this report is providing an update on the management actions from the audit that was conducted in 2023 into our stormwater asset management, particularly as a result of the sewer leaks that were identified in late 2022 and early 2023. The very short story is that there were 5 management action items identified. 3 of those are complete. 2 of them remain outstanding and will be completed by the end of 2025. The reason for them being outstanding and for that timeline has everything to do with the cybersecurity incident. Our CMMS maintenance management system that we were using was decided not to be recovered as we build back better and move to a different system. So until we have a new maintenance management system in place, it's impossible for us to implement those management action items. So we're tied to that new schedule. I will just say very briefly that Public Works Committee also received a full report related to the sewer leaks and initiatives that have been implemented since that time on November the 4th. So there is a lot of information available, and some of that was repeated in this report. Finally, if there are any questions today, Director Shane McCauley and Manager Dipankar Sharma from our Engineering Services Division are on the WebEx should they be needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Winters. We have Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief. I have had the opportunity to interact with Director Winters and his team on a number of files in my ward. Not giving you an exclusive list, but from flooding in basements to flooding on streets, to stormwater management ponds issues, to the leachate and the leachate treatment process coming from the landfill, and the odors that we had to investigate. I understand exactly what this report is saying, and I think that they have done a remarkable effort to complete all of these recommendations within the timelines that we had provided. Unfortunately, the cyber incident does create a bit of a challenge here now. So, but I do want to make it known that I think they have done a remarkable job in my ward, and I have no doubt that they've been doing that in other wards. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any other speakers to this particular item? Seeing none, may I have a mover and a seconder to receive this item, please? Councillor Clark and Councillor Spatafora, may I have the vote, please? And the vote is up. That vote carries 7-0. Moving on to 10.2 is the 2025 City Enrichment Fund Advance Payments. May I have a mover and a seconder to put this report on the floor, please? Councillor Clark and Counselor Chattison. Director Chase, did you want to speak to this at all?
Yes, through the chair, I can provide a quick overview. So this is a report that we bring forward on an annual basis. This actually dates back to 2014 when there was 4 organizations at the time which are in the report. Theatre Aquarius, the Art Gallery of Hamilton, the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra, and the Broad Music Festival were transitioned over to the City Enrichment Fund. It provides approval for staff to be able to provide advance payments, which will reduce any financial hardship and ensure operating funding flows to those organizations. I am joined today by Andrea Carvello, CEF Advisor, and Rebecca Farrat, Grants Coordinator, if there are any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions on this? Seeing none, we already have a mover and a seconder. May I have the vote, please? The vote is up. And that vote carries 7-0. Thank you. Let's move on to 10.3. It's the 2025 Temporary Borrowing and Interim Tax Levy Bylaw, FCS 24049. May I have a mover and a seconder to put this report on the floor, please? Councillor Spadafora, Councillor Beattie. Director Weaver, did you want to add any comments on this one?
Through the chair, Kirk Weaver, Acting Director, Financial Planning, Administration and Policy. Very briefly, it's an annual report that we bring forward this time every year to seek authorization for borrowing funds should we need to in the interim until the 2025 budget is approved, and also similarly to issue interim tax bills until the 2025 budget is adopted. On the borrowing bylaw, I will say that it's required under the Municipal Act that we have this in place, but we have only used it twice, I think, in the late 90s. It's rarely used.
So this sounds like a housekeeping item and ensuring that we're a smooth transition between the two budgets then. GM Zagaric?
Yeah, through the chair, it is exactly a housekeeping item, and it just provides staff the authority. If we were not to have an approved budget and a delay in our tax billing issuances, or because of some event, we weren't able to issue our tax billings, we still have financial obligations with respect to school board remittances to the province, as well as payroll, others. This gives us the authority to borrow funds until such time as we realize those tax proceeds. So again, as Acting Director Weaver identified, I believe the last occurrence was in 1998-99 when the provincial government introduced CVA and delayed the tax issuance because of some tax policy changes. So very much a housekeeping item.
Thank you, GM Zagaric. Any other questions? Seeing none, we do have a mover and a seconder, so please indicate your vote to approve the recommendations in this report, and the vote is up. That vote carries 7-0. On to 10.4, the Governance Review Subcommittee Report, 24-2002 from October 31st. May I have a mover and a seconder to put this report on the floor, please? Councillor Maureen Wilson and Councillor Alex Wilson. That was a slow-moving indication. Any questions for staff, please? I do recognize Councillor Clark first. So Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just get clarification when I'm looking at the schedule in Appendix A? There is a reduction in the number of meetings for council and likewise for standing committees. Is there a total count that the clerk can provide?
Clerk Trenum, please.
Yeah, through you, Chair. In the previous cycle or schedule, there would have been 19 cycles or 19 meetings of regular council. In this one, there are 15, a reduction of 4.
Councillor Clark?
Thank you for that. Just some quick comments.
Yes.
The challenge that I'm having with this recommendation is that the workload that exists on an annual basis for this council and for our staff will not change. we are now condensing that workload into a reduction by 4 of the number of meetings. That means quite clearly that the agendas for those meetings will be larger and longer. And while I understand the intent is to provide more time for staff to complete their reports, we could very clearly change the procedural rules so that staff do have more time to complete their reports without taking away the number of meetings. So I can't support this. I think we are going to regret if we go down this road, because we will have much longer meetings with our staff sitting there waiting to deal with their issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. I recognize Councillor Maureen Wilson, please.
Thank you. If I could, through you to the city clerk, does the new schedule afford committee reports to be in the public realm any longer or any shorter? Through the chair.
City clerk, please.
Through you, Chair. The schedule itself isn't specific to that, but what I can advise is we are making some procedural amendments internally to ensure that we're publishing agendas a little bit sooner, allowing for at least a week for each one is the goal for 2025, as well as strengthening the timelines that staff are working with in terms of report approvals leading up to those publishing dates.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Spatafora, could you take the chair for me, please?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, to Clerk Trenum, is there an opportunity for us to call special general issues committee meetings? So then that way, sometimes our committee meetings are really, really big and long, and we still have other city work to do. So in this particular schedule, is there that opportunity to be a little more flexible?
Clerk Trenum.
Through you, Chair, to the councillor, absolutely. This doesn't take that away. In fact, as we strengthen the timelines with staff, my hope is to better identify issues that may require a separate meeting so that we can hold a meeting on a larger issue that may take 3 hours of debate, including presentations and delegations, to allow for a more fulsome debate on a specific topic like that. That can be done for any of the committees. It could also be done for special council meetings where required.
Councillor?
Thank you. So as part of that, that would also require calling some of those special council meetings does allow us to have better community engagement because we're calling a special council meeting. Or a special committee meeting. And then it also means that we have given enough of the time to fulsomely debate that. Is that correct, through you, Chair?
Clerk Trenum?
I would agree with that. If a special, say, GIC meeting was called, it's to deal with a large topic and would allow for a fulsome debate on that particular matter without lengthening another committee meeting.
Councillor?
Thank you. Those are all my questions. I'll take the chair back.
Thank you.
Okay. If there's no other questions or comments, just waiting. Councillor Clark, please.
So in the past, when special council or GIC meetings, usually it's a special GIC and then a special council meeting right afterwards, we get notice of about 2-3 days. That's it. So I'm trying to understand, if a special GIC meeting, for example, we did the stormwater management fee on a special GIC meeting, and then 15 minutes later, we did a special council meeting, and there was no opportunity to consult the public in between those two meetings. So how do we improve public consultation with special meetings?
Thank you for that question. Perhaps I will ask the clerk if he could weigh in on that.
Yeah, through you, Chair, I think that's an excellent point. When calling a meeting on a specific topic like that, by strengthening some of the timelines that staff are working with in terms of report approvals and getting a really good sense of when a larger topic is coming forward, we plan ahead of that and provide greater public notice for those particular meetings. In the example that you've provided, a 2-day notice for a special meeting or for a special GIC meeting really should be few and far between for more emergency matters. What I'm talking about is where we are forecasting a bigger report that is going to have a lot of public engagement, or that we know is going to garner a greater amount of debate and discussion, we should be planning for that by calling them ahead of time to allow for those delegates as well as time to get the report to council.
Thank you, Chair. I completely agree with the clerk. I was frustrated when we did that earlier in this term. But it doesn't change my concern that the workload that we have will now be spread about in meetings that we are now reducing the number of meetings by 4. And so now the intention is that if the agendas are too long, we're now going to create special GIC meetings and special council meetings. We're actually going to find ourselves back to the same situation where we need those additional meetings to deliberate and consider all of that information and make decisions. So while I appreciate the intentions to make these changes, if we're simply going to add special council meetings and special GICs to replace the 4 meetings that we've removed, then why do this change to the calendar? Why not just simply say to staff, no, you must get your reports to a GIC, standing committee, council 2 weeks in advance, and it's not a last minute thing. Frequently I come to meetings and the document is on the desk that I now have to read. That's unacceptable. The public never gets to see that information sufficient time to deliberate on it. So while I appreciate the intentions, I don't think that the intentions are actually going to improve public engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Seeing as there are no other speakers, we already do have a mover and a seconder for this particular item. May I have the vote, please? And the vote is up. That vote carries 6-1. Thank you. We are moving on to 10.5, which is the 10.5, the proposed changes to Schedule B, fees and gifts and hospitality of the Code of Conduct for Employees policy. May I please have a mover and a seconder to put this report on the floor, please? Councillor Spadafora and Councillor Beatty. Yes, Councillor Beatty. Any questions for staff on this particular item? Councillor Maureen Wilson. I also do note that Executive Director Acting ED Nancy Coca is behind you too. So, but Councillor Maureen Wilson, please.
Thank you, Chair. I really appreciate that. The only thing I don't enjoy about sitting on this half is I always have my back and I don't know who is there, and often comes across as being rude. I'm just trying to understand the recommendation specific to if something is received by staff, they could, I don't have the wording correctly, Chair, but share it with other staff members. And I'm just trying to understand those parameters. And if I could ask staff to just elaborate on what informed them of that recommendation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Nancy Coca, Acting Executive Director of Human Resources. Through the chair, thanks for the question. So the language around sharing often comes from circumstances where staff or teams will get things like baskets or donuts or things that are meant for the team to share. So in the event, those are the types of gifts that are provided. We wanted to be clear that there may be opportunities to share that with the team.
Councillor Wilson?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, and I don't need the chair's help and staff. The issue that I'm concerned about is the proliferation, not just on this council, but across the province of lobbyists and developers taking decision makers out for a round of golf or out to a baseball game or out to a fancy dinner in a fancy restaurant. Where is there a prohibition of that in these proposed schedules.
So when you spoke about counselors, that might be in the next one, but are you speaking about it in relation to employees? Because that's where 10.5 is speaking about it from an employee's perspective.
Yeah, forgive me for that slip of the tongue. It is employees that have been going out and playing rounds of golf with developers or lobbyists. It's employees that have been going out to fancy dinners with developers and lobbyists. That is my concern. Also, I have the concern with council, but that's a separate item. I want to ensure that there is no hint of impropriety with how our staff are dealing with developers, and developers taking folks out to a golf game or a fancy dinner while there may not be an intent. There is a latent or subconscious creation of some form of, well, they were very kind to me, so I'll have to be kind to them. It creates that situation, whether intentional or not by the developer or lobbyist. It does happen. And I can tell you, Chair, that if it didn't happen, lobbyists and developers wouldn't be taking the staff out to those fancy deals.
Thank you. Councillor Clark. Edie Coca, please.
So through the chair, thank you for the question. So we have in the policy proposed criteria relative to when staff are offered things like hospitality. So we've included language that requires staff, when the value does not exceed $50, they would be permitted. However, anything in excess of that, they have to determine whether or not there would be a real or perceived conflict of interest. They have to look at it in the context of a business meeting or an interaction whereby the donor would be present, or in the context of a recognized charitable event. It has to be an infrequent occurrence. It legitimately serves the business purpose. It is part of the employee's professional job duties and responsibilities. And the hospitality is not an attempt to seek special favors or advantages from the employee. There are limited circumstances where employees may be able to participate in hospitality activities that exceeds the $50, so long as the above criteria that I've just read through is met.
Councillor?
So can I ask how staff came to the decision to set the limit at $50?
So through the chair, we conducted a municipal scan of other codes of conduct and similar schedules that exist in other municipalities. The ranges were anywhere from $25 to $100. And in some cases, municipalities would use the term a nominal amount or some other descriptor that didn't actually provide an amount. We thought it would be best to add an amount, and the recommendation was the $50. We also consulted with what we call our policy review group, which is a group of director-level individuals that sit on a policy review team that reviews policies before they come to SLT and council, and through their consultation determined that the $50 would be a reasonable amount.
Councillor?
Thank you. And is there any exclusion for charitable events? So we get invitations, staff get invitations to charitable events that exceed the $50. Is that also included in the $50? Is there no delineation as to whether or not they're being invited to a charitable event or whether or not they're just being invited out to a golf game or a dinner?
Edie Coca?
So through the chair, yes, one of the criteria is around attending charitable events. And again, anything over $50 in limited circumstances can be approved by the employee's GM. So there is some discretion around circumstances where it makes sense, given all the other criteria that I listed are also being met.
And so then the manager who's involved in the signing off would determine whether or not it's proper for them to attend. And there would be documentation that if the event is exceeding the $50, there is or some form of documentation within the manager's office that they were informed about it and they agreed to it. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct. We've actually escalated the approval at the GM level as opposed to managers or directors. And we've also included a recommendation where even those nominal amounts of $50, if those exceed 200 in a calendar year, there is a requirement to report that and track so that we can start to see when those events start to get closer to or beyond the $200,000. And those would also be reported through to the GMs.
Councillor.
Thank you. That's all my questions. I think it's an excellent report and recommendation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We do have a mover and a seconder. May I please have the vote, please? Vote is up. And just as we're waiting for the results, committee, we are at 12:40. I'm just mindful that we do have a follow-up, and that report carries 8-0. We do have a following committee meeting for emergency and community services, so I'm hoping that we can just be mindful of that as we move on. We are now on to 10.7. This is the review of council codes of conduct at other municipalities respecting and limiting or prohibiting the accepting of gifts for elected officials, FCS 24057 citywide. This is to be received, so may I have a mover and a seconder to receive this item, please? Councillor Kretsch and Councillor Maureen Wilson, please. Any comments on this? Okay. Seeing none, let's, may I have the vote, please? Vote is up. It's not on yours? Oh. Councillor Taddison's a yes. That vote carries 8-0. Thank you. We are now moving on to 10.6A, which is the inclusion of studies in the 2024 Development Charges Bylaw, FCS 24051. May I have a mover and a seconder to put this report on the floor, please? Councillor Spadafora and Councillor Taddison. Perhaps Director Kirk-Weaver, is there anything that you wanted to say to this particular topic?
Through the chair, this report, the primary purpose of this report is to amend the development charges bylaw to include growth-related studies. Council may recall, or committee may recall, that as part of Bill 23, studies were removed as an eligible cost. So as we prepared our bylaw that took effect June 1st, we did not include those studies. Through Bill 185, one of the changes was that the growth-related studies became an eligible cost again. They also established through that legislation a process that allowed municipalities 6 months in order to gather the information required and create an updated bylaw, not following necessarily the same level of detail you would for a full background study. So staff has done that in the last number of months, and this report introduces those studies into the bylaw. The studies represent about $100 million in gross cost, $76 million in eligible cost over the next 10 years. And in the bylaw that's been included, and background study that's been included as appendices to the report, there's detail around those studies, as well as the impact on the DC rates, which represent, depending whether it's combined or separated sewer, for a single family home would represent an increase of about $5,000 per unit, or on the non-residential side, 68 cents per square foot. And the proposal is that, should council endorse this, the new bylaw would take effect December 1st. We have undertaken communications with various groups through our email channels. Our development industry liaison group has been kept up to date on this process. And subject to approval, we would have work with our colleagues in communications to ensure that this information is communicated out through our website and other channels following adoption by council. And this represents the conclusion of that 6-month process. The reason it's before you today is that 6-month time period for allowing us to include those studies within the bylaw is coming up on December the 6th.
So we had to get rid of it, and now we're back to having it. Okay.
Correct.
GM Zagaric is nodding as well. So I recognize Councillor Crutch, please.
This is just more of a housekeeping thing. I just wanted to ask when you bring these bylaws forward, if you look ahead to the governance review subcommittee for next week, you'll see that when we make changes to the procedural bylaw, the city clerk there highlighted them in blue, yellow, and then further changes in green, and tracked all the changes there. If we can make this a standard across the city for how we report about every change, that would be so helpful for me, because this isn't a bylaw to amend a bylaw. Like, once we start getting into these layers, right, it becomes very difficult to understand, well, what information is exactly new, what changes are being made, and so it's just hard to track. So if there's ways when we bring these forward to make that clear, and maybe using that system or another system, I don't care what system it is, as long as it's really clear, oh, we're striking this out, or this is new language, or whatever it is, so it quickly can scan through and pick out the parts that are relevant, because reading the entire bylaw is lovely and informative. But I'm not sure that it makes me feel like I understand what changes are being implemented. Otherwise, I get it, and thank you. I'm supportive of the things we're forced to do.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm also recognizing that you asked for things to be changed in different colors. I'm not.
Oh, I'm just saying that, that's just one example of how to do it, which is why I was really clear to say, hey, there are other ways of doing this. That's one example of a way it was done. Surely using the different colors is not always super helpful for a colorblind person like me, but I get your point, Councillor Hoyne.
Thank you. All right. Seeing as there are no other speakers to this, mover into seconder is already up, and the vote is up, please. Councillor Hansen's a yes. And that carries 8-0. Thank you. We are now moving on to general information and other business. At first, we're going to start with the 13.1 amendments to the outstanding business list, and you can see the list in front of you. May I have a mover or seconder to put the amendments of the outstanding business list on the floor, please? Councillor Spadafora and Councillor Beattie? Yes. Any questions on these amendments to the outstanding business list? Okay. Seeing none, may I have the vote? The vote is up. That vote carries 8-0. General Manager Zagaric, any news or anything that you might want to bring up in other business at all? GM Zagaric, any other business? No?
No, through you, Madam Chair, to Councillor Crutch's request, we will look to have a tracked version for council next week.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you so much. Adjournment. May I have a mover and a seconder? It looks like Councillor Taddison and, double hands from Councillor Clark. So since we have a mover and a seconder, may I have the vote, please? And the vote is up. Thank you. That vote carries. Thank you very much, committee. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Chair, and good job.